The sky above Academy City tore open at 2:47 a.m., and nobody heard it happen. Accelerator stood in the center of the Level 6 shift testing chamber, electrodes clinging to his pale skin like parasites. The equipment around him screamed numbers he'd stopped caring about hours ago. 20,000 calculations per second, vector manipulation reaching theoretical limits. His reflection field operating at capacity, while researchers monitored from behind reinforced glass, their faces illuminated by screens, showing data they couldn't fully comprehend. He wasn't listening to them anymore. The voices beyond the glass had become noise variables without value. His attention fixed on the sensation building in his chest. Not pain, not pleasure, something closer to recognition. The feeling that came when an equation finally balanced. The researchers didn't notice the spatial distortion forming 3 meters above his head. Their instruments measured energy output brainwave patterns, the precise angle of vector deflections. They had no sensors for the way reality itself began to bend around him, the air growing thick with potential that had nowhere to go. When the fracture opened, it made no sound. The fabric of space simply admitted defeat. Accelerator looked up just as the rupture swallowed him a wound, and the world hungry for balance. The last thing he saw was the researchers' mouths opening in unison, their warnings arriving too late to matter. Then the testing chamber vanished, replaced by a void that tasted like copper and ozone. He fell through nothing for what might have been seconds or centuries. His reflection field activated, automatically redirecting forces that shouldn't exist, angles that made no geometric sense. When he finally hit solid ground, the impact shattered concrete in a perfect circle around him. New York City's financial district learned about him at 9:23 p.m. local time. Accelerator stood in the crater he'd created, taking inventory. The building stretching overhead bore no resemblance to Academy City's architecture. The air carried different pollution, different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. Even gravity felt marginally altered, though his reflection field had already compensated. Around him, people screamed and scattered. He watched them with clinical detachment, noting their panic responses, their inefficient movement patterns. Some pulled out phones to record him. Others simply ran, which showed better survival instinct. A woman in a business suit had frozen 5 meters away. Her briefcase dropped and forgotten. She stared at him with an expression he'd seen before, the look people wore when confronted with something their worldview had no framework to contain. Accelerator ignored her. He was already processing the strategic situation, cataloging variables. Unknown location, unknown threats, unknown rules of engagement. The optimal response was observation data collection, patience. He didn't get the chance. The first drone arrived 90 seconds after impact, its cameras focusing on him with mechanical precision. Accelerator tracked its approach with mild interest. Military grade, he assessed, noting the weapon systems integrated into its chassis. Whoever controlled this city had rapid response protocols. The drone's speakers crackled to life. Unidentified enhanced individual, remain stationary. You are surrounded. Accelerator said nothing. His reflection field hummed at the edge of his awareness as a constant pressure that had become as natural as breathing. He waited to see what came next. What came next was Orcus. The armored vehicles arrived in formation, establishing a perimeter with practiced efficiency. Soldiers emerged wearing gear he didn't recognize, weapons tracking him with steady purpose. Their communications chatter filled the air with encrypted signals. His mind automatically began parsing for useful data. Behind the military cordon, he sensed other equipment powering up. Scanners, he realized. They were analyzing him, trying to categorize what he was. The familiar sensation of being measured, quantified, reduced to numbers on someone's screen. A man in a white coat stepped forward, flanked by armed guards. His body language projected authority despite the obvious danger. "My name is Dr. Killian," he called out. "We're here to help you. Whatever happened, we can—" "Scan complete," a voice interrupted over the radio. Genetic markers detected. Positive X gene signature. Classification pending. Accelerator's attention sharpened. X gene. An unfamiliar term, but the context suggested biological categorization. They thought he was something he wasn't. The mistake would have been amusing if it weren't so tactically significant. Dr. Killian's expression shifted, a calculated concern replacing his initial diplomatic tone. You're safe now. Orcus is here to ensure your transition proceeds smoothly. We just need you to come with us for... The attack came without further warning. Sentinel units descended from rooftop positions, their plasma cannons already charging. The first volley cut through the air where Accelerator's head had been a microsecond earlier. His reflection field inverted the attack vectors, automatically sending the energy blasts screaming back toward their sources. 3 Sentinels exploded in sequential detonations, their cores overloading from their own reflected fire. The shockwave knocked soldiers off their feet. Windows shattered in buildings half a block away. Civilians who hadn't fled far enough found themselves thrown to the ground by pressure waves that curved around Accelerator like water around stone. He hadn't moved, hadn't needed to. More Sentinels approached from different angles, attempting to overwhelm his defenses through sheer volume of fire. Lasers, kinetic rounds, electromagnetic pulses. Each attack redirected with perfect mathematical precision. The weapon systems that should have vaporized him instead carved burning trails through the air, destroying vehicles and infrastructure in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Accelerator observed the carnage with neutral interest. Their tactics were crude, but educational. Each failed attack taught him something about this world's understanding of physics, their assumptions about how power worked. They fought like people who'd never encountered something that simply didn't care about force. Cease fire! Dr. Killian's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back. Establish containment perimeter. The surviving Sentinels retreated to safer distances, their targeting systems recalculating. The soldiers had already withdrawn, leaving smoking craters and twisted metal where they'd stood moments before. Accelerator remained in his original position, unmarked, untouched. He became aware of cameras, dozens of them, civilian phones and news drones capturing every second of the engagement. The footage would spread, he realized. Information propagating through networks he didn't control, shaping narratives he hadn't written. Above the battle scene, a helicopter circled with a news station logo emblazoned on its side. The reporter's voice carried on the wind, breathless with fear and excitement. Unprecedented destruction in downtown Manhattan. The unidentified mutant has already... Mutant. Another categorization, another assumption layered on top of incomplete data. Accelerator filed the term away for analysis. Whatever it meant in this world, it clearly carried weight. Dr. Killian was speaking urgently into a communications device, his earlier composure fractured. Level 7 threat at minimum, possibly Omega. We need immediate reinforcement and... He paused, listening. No conventional containment won't work. You saw what happened to the Sentinels. We need a different approach. Accelerator considered his options. He could leave. His reflection field would carry him over the buildings and away from this confrontation. But leaving meant abandoning data, losing the opportunity to understand where he'd landed and what resources existed here. More importantly, these people had attacked him. They'd made assumptions, deployed weapons, attempted to impose their framework on something they couldn't comprehend. The response to such behavior was straightforward, demonstrate the cost of that mistake. He took a step forward. Every weapon within 100 meters immediately locked onto him. Targeting lasers painted red dots across his body, though they'd do no good. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, pressure building like a storm about to break. Stand down. Dr. Killian's voice carried an edge of desperation now. We are authorized to use lethal force if... Accelerator raised one hand, palm up. The gesture looked almost casual. What followed was anything but. The atmospheric pressure inverted in a sphere 50 meters across. Air molecules reversed their trajectories, creating a vacuum that pulled everything inward before exploding outward with hurricane force. Vehicles flipped like toys. Soldiers in full armor flew backward into buildings. The Sentinels' hovering systems failed against wind that defied meteorological logic. When the disturbance settled, Accelerator stood in a circle of destruction that hadn't touched a single civilian. The people who'd been cowering in doorways and behind debris remained exactly where they were, protected by vector calculations too precise for collateral damage. The message was clear enough, even for humans. I decide what breaks. Dr. Killian pulled himself upright, blood running from a cut above his eye. His communications device had been torn away in the blast, leaving him isolated from whatever command structure had sent him. He stared at Accelerator with an expression that had moved beyond fear into something closer to recognition. "What are you?" he whispered. Accelerator didn't answer. The question was irrelevant. What mattered was what happened next, how this world's systems responded to a variable they couldn't control. He didn't have to wait long. The first news broadcast went live 6 minutes after the initial confrontation. By the time Accelerator had begun walking away from the destruction, major networks had already labeled him. The footage played on loops, analyzed by experts who had no expertise in what they were witnessing. Clearly an Omega-level mutant, possibly the most dangerous we've seen since. Orcus deployed standard containment protocols, but as you can see from this footage, no confirmed casualties, but property damage is estimated in the millions. The narrative was being written in real time, shaped by fear and incomplete information. Accelerator, walking through streets that parted before him like water, listened to the broadcasts with clinical attention. They were building a story around him, assigning motives and meanings he'd never claimed. Interesting, he thought. This world had systems for processing threats, categories for classification. They'd seen enhanced individuals before, had protocols and procedures. But their frameworks were built on assumptions that didn't apply to him. They thought he was one of them. A mutant, whatever that meant. Someone who could be understood, predicted, eventually contained. They were wrong. By midnight, 3 things had happened. First, every major news network had aired the footage of his arrival, each adding their own interpretation. Some called him a terrorist. Others suggested he might be a victim displaced by some experiment gone wrong. None of them had enough information to be correct. Second, Orcus had officially classified him as an unregistered Omega-level mutant and issued a public statement about enhanced individual safety protocols. The political machinery was already in motion, turning his existence into justification for policies that had been waiting for the right catalyst. Third, somewhere in a mansion in Westchester, a group of people who actually understood what Omega-level meant began making very different plans. Accelerator felt none of this as relevant. He'd found a building under construction, its upper floors still skeletal framework open to the night air. From this vantage point, he could observe the city's response patterns, catalog their capabilities, wait for whatever came next. The vector calculations never stopped, a constant background hum processing every force that dared approach. Wind radiation, the electromagnetic spectrum, all of it bent around him according to rules this world hadn't written. He would learn this place's physics, its power structures, its points of leverage. And if his search for level 6 required breaking whatever passed for order here, that was simply another variable in the equation. The night settled over New York with unusual quiet, as if the city itself recognized that something fundamental had shifted. In government offices, encrypted communications flew between agencies arguing jurisdiction. In underground bunkers, tactical teams reviewed footage and planned responses. In the mansion in Westchester, a telepath reached out across the distance and touched the edge of something that made her recoil. Accelerator noticed none of it. He was already running calculations for tomorrow, processing vectors, preparing for whatever this world thought it could throw at him. Let them come, he thought. Let them try their weapons, their categories, their frameworks for containing the uncontainable. He would show them what it meant when mathematics stopped caring about their rules. The city's lights stretched to the horizon, millions of lives existing in patterns they believed were stable. Accelerator looked down at it all, with the same expression he'd worn in the testing chamber, neutral interest in an equation not yet solved. Tomorrow the X-Men would come. Tomorrow the real education would begin. But tonight, he simply existed, a theorem proven in flesh, standing outside every framework this world had built to explain power. And in the wreckage of downtown Manhattan, Dr. Killian made a phone call that would set everything else in motion. His hands still shaking as he spoke the words that damned them all. "We have an Omega-level situation. God help us, we might have created something worse." 8 hours after the Manhattan incident, the footage had already cycled through every major network 3 times over. The Blackbird cut through pre-dawn air at Mach 2, its stealth systems rendering it invisible to conventional radar. Inside the cabin, Scott Summers reviewed tactical data on a transparent display, his visor's red glow reflecting off the screen's surface. The footage from Manhattan played on loop, buildings damage. But standing sentinels torn apart, and at the center of it all, a figure who'd barely moved. "Beast confirmation on the bioscan." Scott's voice carried the weight of command, each word measured. Hank McCoy hunched over his portable analysis station, blue fur bristling as he manipulated holographic data with precise gestures. "The energy signature is inconsistent with known mutant profiles. There's definitely genetic material present, but the pattern doesn't match our X gene database. It's as if someone took a mutant template and introduced variables that shouldn't exist. Worse, Cerebro's readings are being contaminated, possibly by the same multiversal residue that brought him here. We're getting a false positive on X gene markers." Jean Grey sat with her eyes closed, fingers pressed to her temples. Her red hair caught the cabin's blue emergency lighting, creating shadows that shifted with the aircraft's movement. "I can't get a clear read. There's something there, but it's like trying to touch fog. Every time I reach for it, the sensation slips away." "Orcus has already classified him as Omega level," Scott said, pulling up another screen. "They've released a statement calling this a mutant terrorism incident and deployed Sentinel protocols across 3 boroughs." The media's running with it. Storm watched Rain streak across the viewport, her white hair pulled back in a practical braid. "They waste no time turning tragedy into ammunition. How many civilians were harmed?" "That's the strange part," Scott replied. 0 confirmed casualties. Property damage is extensive, but every witness account describes the destruction as surgical. Nothing touched anyone who wasn't armed. Logan leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. The Blackbird's recycled air carried traces of jet fuel and ozone that his enhanced senses cataloged automatically. "So this kid, if it is a kid, knows restraint. That make him more dangerous or less?" "More," Jean said quietly, her eyes still closed. "Someone with that much power who can exercise precision isn't acting on instinct. They're thinking, planning." The Blackbird began its descent. Manhattan's skyline emerging from darkness like teeth. Scott stood, magnetic boots anchoring him as the aircraft banked. "Our priority is civilian safety and de-escalation. Storm, you'll control the airspace, no more Sentinel bombardment from above. Logan, perimeter security. Keep any Orcus reinforcements from turning this into a war zone. Jean with me. We try talking first. And if talking doesn't work?" Logan's question held no judgment, just tactical necessity. Scott's jaw tightened. "Then we adapt. But we don't under any circumstances give Orcus the footage they want. No mutant rampage, no uncontrolled escalation. We're better than their narrative." The landing was silent, repulsor jets, bleeding velocity without the scream of conventional engines. The team emerged into a street that dawn hadn't fully reached, shadows still pooling between buildings. The damage from last night's confrontation formed a trail, scorched pavement, twisted metal barriers, windows blown inward from pressure that defied meteorological logic. Accelerator stood in the center of an intersection 3 blocks from the landing zone. He hadn't moved since taking up position an hour ago, his pale hair catching the first rays of sunlight. The white of his clothing seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making him look less like a person and more like a void cut into the world's fabric. Scott approached with deliberate slowness, hands visible and empty. Jean walked slightly behind and to his left, her posture open but alert. The air between them and their target felt thick, as if reality itself had become denser. "My name is Scott Summers," he called out, stopping 20 meters away. "We're here to help. Whatever happened last night, whatever brought you here, we understand what it's like to be different, to have abilities that others fear." Accelerator's head turned, fractionally red eyes fixing on Scott with the interest a scientist might show a test result. He said nothing. Jean took a careful step forward. "I'm Jean. We're not with the government, and we're not here to fight you. We just want to understand what happened. Can you tell us where you're from?" The silence stretched. Around them, the city was waking delivery trucks, making their rounds, early commuters emerging from subway stations. Each civilian who rounded a corner and saw the standoff immediately reversed course survival instinct, overriding curiosity. Scott tried again. "The people who attacked you last night made a mistake. They assumed threat without verification. We're not making that assumption, but we need to know, are you in control? Do you need assistance?" Something shifted in Accelerator's expression, a micro movement that might have been amusement. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat affect of someone reciting data. "Control isn't the relevant question. Try again." The words landed like equations waiting to be solved. Scott processed the response, adjusting his approach. "All right. Different question. Do you intend harm to anyone in this city?" "Harm is a consequence, not an intention," Accelerator replied. "Ask better questions or stop wasting processing time." Jean's eyes narrowed, her telepathic senses reaching out more aggressively. The moment her consciousness touched the edges of Accelerator's mind, the world lurched. It wasn't an attack, not in any conventional sense. But the feedback hit her like standing too close to a speaker when the volume spiked. Her mental probe encountered something that shouldn't exist in a human mind. Pure mathematical process vectors calculating themselves. Awareness that operated on principles she couldn't classify. And beneath it all, a coldness that made the void of space seem warm by comparison. Not a counterattack, just the cost of touching something that didn't map to human cognition. She gasped, staggering backward. Scott caught her arm, his concern overriding tactical positioning. "Jean, he's not..." She struggled for words that could encompass what she'd felt. "There's thought there, but it's not human. It's like touching a running calculation that happens to be conscious." Accelerator tilted his head, the gesture mechanical. "Telepathy. Inefficient delivery system for data transfer, but interesting." His attention shifted fully to Jean, and she felt the weight of it like pressure on her skull. "Try harder. Show me what this world considers power." It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, delivered with the emotional investment of someone proposing a physics experiment. Scott's hand moved to his visor fingers, finding the familiar control. A warning shot, low intensity, aimed at the pavement between them. Enough to demonstrate capability without lethal intent. "Stand down. We're not here to demonstrate anything. If you're not going to communicate..." The optic blast erupted in a controlled burst. A crimson beam of concussive force calibrated to crack concrete. It crossed the distance in microseconds, carrying just enough kinetic energy to serve as punctuation to his warning. The beam reversed direction mid-flight. Scott barely had time to process the impossibility. Before his own attack slammed into him, the force vector inverted with perfect mathematical precision. He flew backward, body armor, absorbing impact that should have shattered bone. The wall behind him crumbled as he hit brick and mortar, exploding outward. Jean's telekinesis caught him before he could fall through the building, entirely cushioning his body with invisible force. But the message had been delivered with surgical clarity. Your power means nothing here. Storm descended from her aerial position, winds gathering around her with the promise of lightning. The sky darkened as she pulled moisture from the surrounding air, temperature dropping as she prepared to. The atmospheric pressure inverted. Her control over the weather didn't vanish. Storm could still feel the currents, still sense the electromagnetic potential in the clouds. But the vectors she'd spent decades mastering suddenly obeyed different mathematics. Wind that should have flowed outward spiraled inward. Rain that gravity demanded fall upward instead rose in defiance of planetary physics. She fought for control, pouring decades of experience into reasserting her will over the elements. For 3 seconds, she managed to hold the contradiction stable. Then Accelerator's calculations overwhelmed her instinctive understanding, and the weather simply did what he told it to. The resulting storm cell formed directly above a crowded residential block, hail and wind threatening to turn morning commutes into casualty events. Storm abandoned her attack immediately, redirecting all her power toward damage control. She pulled the storm apart before it could harm anyone, dispersing the unnatural weather pattern across miles of sky. When she descended back to street level, her expression carried something between frustration and respect. "He turned my own power against bystanders without raising a hand," she said, breathing hard from the exertion. "Forced me to choose between pressing an attack and protecting civilians." Logan had moved during the chaos, circling to approach from Accelerator's flank. His adamantium claws extended with their familiar snicked healing factor already primed for whatever damage came next. He'd fought gods and monsters, survived wars that should have killed him a dozen times over. Speed and regeneration, those were advantages that couldn't be easily negated. He covered the distance in a blur claws, aimed for non-lethal disable points. The strike would have worked against almost anyone. Accelerator didn't dodge. He simply existed in the path of the attack, and Logan's momentum became his enemy. The vector of his charge reversed mid-leap. His own kinetic energy, the force of adamantium-laced muscle driving forward, converted into equal and opposite reaction. Logan found himself flying backward at the same speed he'd approached his body, treating the air like a solid wall he'd run into at full sprint. He hit the pavement hard enough to create a crater adamantium skeleton, preventing death but doing nothing for the pain. His healing factor began immediate repairs, mending internal damage from an impact that had used his own strength against him. "Well," he groaned, pulling himself upright. "That's new." Scott regained his feet armor, scorched but intact. Around them, the engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds and left the X-Men scattered, damaged, and fundamentally outmaneuvered, not by superior firepower or overwhelming force, but by something more fundamental, their own capabilities turned into liabilities. "Fall back," Scott ordered, the words tasting like defeat. "Immediate withdrawal to safe distance. Priority 1, civilian evacuation." Jean supported Storm, who was still recovering from the atmospheric manipulation. Logan limped over, his healing factor working overtime. They retreated in formation, never turning their backs, fully maintaining tactical awareness, even in withdrawal. Accelerator watched them go with the same neutral expression he'd worn since the engagement began. No triumph, no anger, just data collected and processed. When they'd cleared 2 blocks, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, his interest in them apparently exhausted. The Blackbird lifted off 15 minutes later, its medical bay occupied, and its crew silent. Scott stared at the tactical readout, analyzing what had gone wrong. Every attack pattern, every power application, all of it predicted and countered before they'd even completed the thought. Hank broke the silence first, his analytical mind already processing the implications. His ability isn't just reflection or absorption. He's manipulating vectors, the fundamental directional components of force itself. Anything with magnitude and direction becomes his to control. Kinetic energy, electromagnetic fields, thermal dynamics, All of it operates on vector principles. Can we counter it? Scott asked. Counter mathematics? Hank's laugh held no humor. We'd have better luck arguing with gravity. What he's doing is functionally rewriting the rules of physics in his immediate vicinity. Our powers all rely on those same rules. We brought equations to a fight with the mathematician who wrote them. Jean had her eyes closed again, replaying the sensation of that brief mental contact. He's not a mutant. I'm certain of it now. The genetic signature Cerebro detected is being spoofed by multiversal contamination residue from whatever brought him here. It's mimicking X gene markers just enough to trigger a false positive. And I don't think he knows we know that yet. Scott turned to face her. You're sure? The thought patterns were wrong. Mutant abilities, even at Omega level, still interface with human neurology. They're extensions of who we are. What I felt in him. She struggled for the right words. It was like touching a foreign operating system running on hardware that superficially resembles a human brain. The thoughts are there, but the architecture underneath is completely alien. Storm spoke from where she sat, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just discovered their mastery meant nothing. Orcus doesn't know this. They've classified him as one of us, and they're building their narrative on that foundation. If we go public with the truth, Logan started, they'll call it mutant propaganda, Scott finished. Orcus controls the data stream. They've already released their analysis complete with doctored gene scans showing X gene markers. Any evidence we present contradicting their story will be labeled as us protecting our own. Hank manipulated his console, pulling up news feeds and social media analytics. The footage from their engagement was already circulating, edited into minute-long clips with inflammatory headlines. Mutant battle destroys Manhattan block. X-Men unable to control Omega threat. Civilian areas at risk as enhanced individuals clash. Orcus has seeded the narrative beautifully, Hank observed with bitter admiration. They're using him as proof that their Sentinel programs are necessary. Every second of our failure is ammunition for their political machinery. The Blackbird's communications array lit up with incoming priority signals. Scott opened the channel. Professor Xavier's voice filling the cabin. Scott, I've been following the situation. Are you all safe? Bruised but functional, Scott replied. Professor, we have a problem. Multiple problems, actually. He's not what Orcus claims, but we can't prove it without access to their data streams. And even if we could, the public wouldn't believe us, Xavier finished. I know. I attempted my own telepathic contact while you were engaged. The experience was unsettling. His mind operates on principles I've never encountered. I couldn't establish any kind of meaningful connection. Jean leaned forward. Professor, if both of us can't reach him telepathically, what are our options? The pause that followed spoke volumes. Charles Xavier had spent decades advocating peaceful coexistence, finding diplomatic solutions using his vast telepathic power to bridge gaps between human and mutant. To hear him admit limitations carried weight. I'm not certain yet, he said finally. But what I am certain of is this Orcus will use this situation to push for expanded Sentinel deployment, possibly even national registration protocols. We're looking at a political crisis that will outlast the physical threat. Scott, I need you to prioritize containment not of him, but of the damage to mutant-human relations. How? The question came out harsher than Scott intended. We just got publicly humiliated by someone Orcus has labeled as one of us. Our entire tactical doctrine relies on understanding powers through mutant frameworks. He's operating outside those frameworks entirely. Then we adapt our doctrine, Xavier replied calmly. In the meantime, protect civilians. Document everything. When Orcus overreaches, and they will, we need to be positioned as the responsible alternative, if not the defeated opposition. The channel closed, leaving the X-Men in contemplative silence. Below them, Manhattan continued its morning routine, millions of people unaware that the rules governing their reality had just been rewritten by someone who viewed physics as a suggestion. Hank pulled up his analysis again, running calculations that grew more disturbing the deeper he went. If I'm reading these energy signatures correctly, what we witnessed wasn't him at full capacity. He was processing our attacks, learning our patterns. We weren't a threat, we were a training exercise. Great, Logan muttered. We're teaching him how to fight better, that'll help. Scott made a decision, the kind that came from years of leadership during impossible situations. We pull back. Regroup. Let Orcus throw their sentinels at him if they want. We focus on civilian protection and damage control. When he moves again, and he will, we'll be ready with better intelligence and fewer assumptions. And if Orcus's response creates a disaster, Storm asked. Then we do what we always do, Scott replied. We save who we can and live with the consequences of what we can't. The Blackbird banked toward Westchester, leaving Manhattan behind. Below, emergency services responded to the aftermath of a battle that had lasted less than a minute, but would echo for months. News helicopters circled like carrion birds, feeding footage to networks that were already writing tomorrow's headlines. In a command center deep beneath the Orcus facility, Dr. Killian watched the same footage on screens that covered an entire wall. Around him, analysts worked to extract every possible data point from the engagement-building threat profiles and tactical models. The X-Men engaged and withdrew, one analyst reported. Minimal damage to the target, significant strategic defeat for mutant leadership. Public perception is shifting rapidly in our favor. Killian barely heard him. He was watching Accelerator walk through the wreckage, the figure's posture suggesting complete disinterest in what had just transpired. Tag all footage showing civilian safety. I want that circulated widely, proof that our Sentinel protocols are necessary when even the X-Men can't contain an Omega-level threat. Sir, about the genetic analysis, another analyst hesitated. There are some irregularities in the X gene signature. It reads positive, but the structure is. File it as inconclusive and move on, Killian interrupted. The public doesn't need to understand genetics. They need to understand threat levels and appropriate responses. This individual demonstrated Omega-level capabilities. That's sufficient for our purposes. The analyst looked uncomfortable, but complied, relegating the contradictory data to a classified subfolder that would never see public scrutiny. Orcus's narrative required simplicity. Mutant threat, technological solution, public safety. Complications undermined that story. Killian zoomed in on Accelerator's face, studying the expression that had remained unchanged throughout the entire engagement. No anger, no satisfaction, not even the adrenaline rush that combat typically produced. Just the blank assessment of someone conducting an experiment and recording results. What are you? Killian whispered to the screen, echoing his question from the previous night. But this time he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. In Westchester, the X-Men touched down to a mansion already preparing for the political fallout. Students watched the news with varying expressions of fear and defiance, seeing their public defenders overwhelmed by someone labeled as one of their own. Scott stood in the hangar long after the others had left, staring at his hands. The optic blast that had been his primary weapon since adolescence, the power he'd spent years learning to control with precision, all of it rendered meaningless by an opponent who could make force itself obey different rules. Jean found him there an hour later, her presence announced only by the familiar warmth of her mind touching his. You're wondering if we made it worse, she said quietly. We definitely didn't make it better. Scott's voice carried the weight of leadership that sometimes felt like drowning. Orcus got exactly what they wanted: footage of mutants failing to protect humans from another mutant. The fact that he's probably not a mutant won't matter once their narrative takes root. So we fight the narrative, Jean replied, moving to stand beside him. We document, we investigate, we find the truth and present it in ways they can't easily dismiss. It's slower than a fight, but it's the only fight that actually matters, Scott finished. He turned to look at her, his visor hiding eyes that carried more exhaustion than the physical damage could explain. I'm tired, Jean. Tired of every crisis being used as proof that we're dangerous. Tired of winning battles and losing wars. And now this someone who makes our powers look like children playing with toys. Jean took his hand, the gesture simple and grounding. Then we stop fighting his way. We're trying to punch math like Beast said. Instead, we need to think like mathematicians ourselves. Find the variables he can't control, the factors he's not accounting for. Like what? Like the fact that he's alone, Jean said. No support structure, no resources, no understanding of this world's political landscape. He might be able to redirect any physical force, but he can't redirect public opinion or institutional power. That's where we have the advantage. Scott considered this, his tactical mind already exploring the implications. We make it a different kind of fight. Not power against power, but strategy against capability, Jean finished. Exactly. We can't beat him in direct confrontation. But we can shape the battlefield, control the variables, turn his strengths into limitations. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was a direction which felt like progress after a morning of absolute defeat. As the sun climbed higher over Westchester, the X-Men began planning for a war that wouldn't be won with powers or punches, but with the slower, harder work of changing minds and shifting narratives. And in Manhattan, Accelerator continued his patient observation of this new world, each data point bringing him closer to understanding the systems that govern power here. The X-Men had been educational, their abilities consistent with local physics. Their tactical choices constrained by ethical frameworks he found predictably limiting. Tomorrow would bring new variables, new opponents with different capabilities, new data to process and incorporate into his evolving understanding. He looked forward to it with the anticipation of a scientist approaching a particularly interesting problem. The solution wasn't clear yet, but the equation was taking shape. And mathematics, unlike humans, never lied about its conclusions. Emma Frost didn't believe in wasting time on fear. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, watching the city recover from another night of disrupted sleep. Emergency crews still worked the Manhattan damage zones, their floodlights creating artificial daylight against pre-dawn darkness. News helicopters circled overhead like insects drawn to decay, feeding endless footage to networks that had stopped distinguishing between reporting and spectacle. Her reflection in the glass wore white, a deliberate choice, as all her choices were. The color projected confidence when others saw chaos, control when the world demanded panic. Behind her, Sebastian Shaw paced with the restless energy of someone accustomed to dominating rooms through physical presence. The X-Men failed, Shaw said, not for the first time. Publicly, spectacularly failed. This is an opportunity we can't... I'm aware of the opportunity. Emma interrupted, her tone carrying the kind of frost that had nothing to do with her secondary mutation. I'm also aware that throwing more bodies at a mathematical problem won't solve the equation. The X-Men tried force. Orcus tried overwhelming firepower. Both approaches treated him as a conventional threat. And you're proposing what exactly? A strongly worded letter? Emma turned from the window, her blue eyes finding Shaw with the precision of a scalpel finding flesh. I'm proposing we do what we've always done better than anyone else. We offer him what he actually wants, not what we assume he needs. The X-Men approached with morality. Orcus approached with containment. Both fundamental misunderstandings of what drives someone like him. Shaw stopped pacing, his interest finally caught. The Hellfire Club had survived centuries by understanding one simple principle. Everyone wanted something, and the key to power was identifying that want before they did. And what if he decides we're expendable? You're proposing we invite a hurricane into a ballroom and hope it follows social protocols. Hurricanes follow physics, Emma replied coolly. Which means they're predictable if you understand the mathematics. He operates on similar principles, cause-effect optimization. That makes him manageable in ways that emotional actors never are. I've done my research, Emma replied, moving to her desk where holographic displays showed compiled data from every available source. Footage from the initial arrival, the Orcus engagement, the X-Men's tactical defeat. All of it analyzed frame by frame. Watch his body language. He doesn't react to threats, doesn't posture when attacked. But here, she isolated a segment showing Accelerator's expression during Beast's analysis attempt. When confronted with novel data with systems he doesn't understand, there's engagement. Brief, clinical, but present. So he's curious, Shaw said. That's hardly unique. He's not curious. Curiosity implies emotion, investment in discovery for its own sake. This is different. Emma pulled up the footage of his first words to the X-Men, replaying the audio. Control isn't the relevant question. Try again. He's evaluating input quality, sorting useful data from noise. He doesn't care about power for domination. He cares about information for optimization. Shaw considered this, his strategic mind already exploring implications. If he's driven by data collection rather than conquest, then offering him resources access to information. Orcus and the X-Men can't provide. Exactly, Emma finished. We don't threaten, don't moralize, don't try to contain. We simply make him aware that we possess something valuable. Then we let him decide whether the exchange is worth his time. And if he decides we're not worth his time, Emma's smile carried no warmth. Then we've learned something useful about his decision-making process, which is information we didn't have before. Either outcome serves our purposes. She pulled up a final file, classified data acquired through channels the Hellfire Club had spent decades cultivating. Omega-level mutant profiles, threat assessments from various global intelligence agencies, fragmented schematics from Orcus's Omega Threshold project. This is what we offer. Not friendship, not alliance, just information he can't easily acquire elsewhere. The Hellfire Gala is in 72 hours. That gives us a deadline which creates urgency without appearing desperate. You're inviting him to the gala? Shaw's tone carried genuine surprise. Emma, that's strategic theater, she interrupted. The gala is designed to project mutant power, unity, diplomatic legitimacy. Having him there sends multiple messages simultaneously. To Orcus, it suggests we can negotiate where they failed. To the X-Men, it demonstrates alternative approaches to containment. To him, it provides access to concentrated data about this world's power structures. Everyone gets something from the arrangement. Shaw moved to stand beside her, studying the data streams with renewed interest. And when the X-Men inevitably object to our methods, let them object. Charles Xavier believes in redemption and understanding. We believe in pragmatism and survival. The question isn't which philosophy is morally superior. It's which one keeps mutant kind alive when the next crisis arrives. Emma closed the displays with a gesture, the holographic data collapsing into darkness. I'm making contact tonight. Alone. That's non-negotiable. Emma said, her telepathic presence unfurling like a blade held casually but unmistakably ready. Whatever he is, he's demonstrated the ability to redirect physical force with perfect precision. Taking backup only provides additional vectors for him to manipulate. This requires a different kind of approach. She didn't wait for Shaw's response. The decision was made, and Emma Frost had never been in the habit of seeking permission for strategies she knew would work. 3 hours later, she stood on a rooftop in Lower Manhattan. The location triangulated from pattern analysis of his movements. He preferred high vantage points, places where observation came easily and approach vectors were limited. The building she'd chosen was still under construction, its upper floors nothing but skeletal framework and exposed rebar. Accelerator was already there when she arrived, standing at the edge where safety regulations meant nothing to someone who could redirect gravity itself. He didn't turn as she approached, but she felt his attention shift, a subtle change in the air pressure vectors, recalculating to account for her presence. "I wondered which one would come," he said, his voice carrying that same flat effect she'd heard in the recordings. The telepaths or the politicians, both would have been inefficient. Emma stopped 10 meters away, close enough to demonstrate confidence, far enough to avoid appearing threatening. "Emma Frost. I represent interests that are neither governmental nor ideological. Simply practical. The Hellfire Club." Not a question. He'd done his research too then. Old money pretending to be new power. Baroque hierarchy masking straightforward resource consolidation. An accurate assessment, Emma replied, impressed despite herself. "Though I'd argue we've streamlined considerably since our Baroque period. We're here because you're obviously not a mutant, despite what Orcus's public statements claim, and that discrepancy creates opportunities." That got his attention. Accelerator turned fully to face her red eyes, evaluating with the clinical precision of someone examining a specimen under magnification. "Explain." "Orcus needs you to be a mutant," Emma said, her words chosen with the care of someone navigating a minefield. Their entire political platform requires the narrative of enhanced individuals as existential threats requiring technological solutions. The X-Men need you to be something they can understand, categorize, eventually redeem. Both groups are operating on assumptions that don't match observable reality. And your group, we need you to be exactly what you are, a variable nobody else knows how to process. Chaos is opportunity, properly leveraged. Emma pulled up a holographic display from her wrist device, data streams appearing in the air between them. Omega-level mutant profiles, global threat assessments, Orcus technology specifications, information they're keeping classified because knowledge is the only currency that matters in their framework. Accelerator studied the data with that same intense focus she'd seen in the footage. His eyes tracked information flows, processing speeds that suggested computational capability far beyond baseline human. Access conditions. Attendance at the Hellfire Gala in 3 days. You appear as our guest, which sends specific messages to specific audiences. In exchange, you get unrestricted access to our intelligence networks, our compiled research on this world's power structures, and contact with individuals who might actually interest you. And what do you get? Emma smiled, the expression calculated to convey honesty through apparent cynicism. Leverage. The ability to say we negotiated where others failed. Political capital, with groups who currently see mutants as uniformly unable to handle Omega-level threats. And information about you, obviously, though. I suspect you've already accounted for that in your calculations. Obviously? Accelerator agreed. His attention shifted from the data to Emma herself, and she felt the weight of that assessment like physical pressure. You say mutants, but you don't think I'm one of them. You don't read like one, Emma replied carefully. Your signature doesn't behave like any X-gene expression I've studied, and I've studied them all. But what you are matters less than what you can do and what leverage that creates in current political landscapes. Obviously, Accelerator agreed. His attention shifted from the data to Emma herself, and she felt the weight of that assessment like physical pressure. You're telepathic. You haven't tried to probe my mind. Why? Here was the dangerous part. Emma had reviewed the footage of Jean Grey's attempt, seen the telepath stagger backward from contact that should have been routine. She'd felt Xavier's concern rippling through their occasional mental communications. Every instinct screamed that touching this consciousness would carry costs she couldn't predict. But showing fear would end the negotiation immediately. Because I learn more from what you choose to tell me than what I could rip from your thoughts, Emma said, the lie wrapped in enough truth to pass casual inspection. Telepathy is crude when applied to unwilling subjects. It damages data integrity, creates defensive responses that corrupt future interactions. I prefer cleaner methodologies. Accelerator's expression shifted microscopically, not quite approval, but something adjacent to recognition. Test it. Emma's confidence flickered. I'm sorry. Your telepathy. Test it against my consciousness, not deep probe surface contact. You want information about decision-making processes, operational boundaries. This is the efficient path to that data. It was a trap, had to be. Except his body language suggested genuine scientific curiosity rather than aggressive challenge. He was offering himself as an experimental subject the same way he'd let the X-Men attack to gather data on their capabilities. Emma weighed the strategic value of accepting against the risk of whatever feedback had traumatized Jean Grey. The potential intelligence gain was enormous. Understanding how his mind worked would give the Hellfire Club advantages that no other faction possessed. But if the contact went badly, if she ended up incapacitated like Jean had been, she made the decision that had defined her entire career: calculated risk in service of greater advantage. Very well, Emma said, her telepathic senses unfurling with exquisite care. But understand, if this causes damage to either of us, the negotiation ends immediately. Acceptable terms. Emma reached out with her consciousness, the psychic touch light as spider silk. Her telepathy operated on principles of connection, finding the neural pathways that defined thought and using them as conduits for communication. In a baseline human, this felt like sliding into warm water. Natural resistance, but fundamentally compatible architectures. Touching Accelerator's mind was like pressing her hand against a running engine. The sensation hit her in layers. First came the sheer speed thoughts processing at rates that made conventional cognition look like geological time. Then the structure consciousness, organized around mathematical principles rather than narrative logic. Emotions existed, but were filed as variables rather than driving forces. Memory functioned like database queries rather than experiential recall, and underneath it all, that coldness. Not cruelty, not malice, just absolute absence of the warmth that defined human consciousness, like peering into machinery that happened to be self-aware. Emma maintained the contact for precisely 3 seconds before withdrawing her control, preventing the gasp that Jean had shown, but unable to suppress the subtle tremor in her hands. Not a counterattack, she realized. Just incompatibility at such a fundamental level that her telepathy couldn't find purchase. Like trying to read a book written in mathematics instead of language. You felt it. Accelerator observed clinical interest evident in his tone. The structural difference: your telepathy assumes consciousness operates on human neural architecture. Mine doesn't. Emma steadied herself, years of practiced composure, reasserting control over instinctive reaction. An accurate assessment. Your mind processes information through frameworks I don't have reference for. It's not that you're immune to telepathy, you're simply incompatible with the assumptions telepathy makes about how thought works. Correct. Accelerator returned his attention to the holographic data still displaying between them. Your offer has value. I'll attend your gala. But understand, I'm not joining your faction, endorsing your politics, or providing legitimacy to whatever power games you're playing. I'm there for data, access, and environmental observation. Nothing more. Those terms are acceptable, Emma said, relief flooding through her in ways she'd never admit aloud. I'll send you the location and credentials. The gala begins at sunset in 3 days. Dress code is formal, though I suspect you'll interpret that however you see fit. Probably. Emma turned to leave, then paused. The question had been nagging at her since first seeing the footage, and this might be her only chance to ask. Why did you stop after the X-Men retreated, after you demonstrated your capabilities? You could have continued. Pressed the advantage, established dominance. But you just walked away. Accelerator looked at her with something that might have been amusement, if his emotional range included such frivolities. Because I'd gathered sufficient data. Continuing would have been redundant. Efficiency doesn't waste resources on conclusions already reached. The answer was perfectly logical, perfectly cold, and perfectly terrifying in its implications. He'd spent hours listening to the city news broadcasts, police bands, encrypted communications channels, everything processed as raw data. The Hellfire Club's name had appeared often enough in financial networks and political chatter to merit investigation. Emma descended from the rooftop with more questions than she'd arrived with, but also with something valuable confirmation that this entity operated on principles the Hellfire Club could work with, even if they couldn't fully comprehend them. Back at her penthouse, Shaw waited with obvious impatience. "Well, he's accepted the invitation?" Emma said, pouring herself a drink with hands that had finally stopped trembling. She caught her reflection in the glass diamond-hard composure, reasserting itself over the brief crack that touching an alien consciousness had created. A slow breath, deliberate and controlled. The mask settling back into place. Shaw noticed because Shaw always noticed weakness. He said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. "He'll attend the gala as our guest." Emma continued, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty her hands had shown moments before. "And the telepathic probe?" Emma took a long swallow before answering. "Inconclusive. His consciousness operates on architecture that telepathy isn't designed to interface with. It's not a defense, it's fundamental incompatibility. Like trying to run software designed for human wetware on a quantum computer." Shaw absorbed this information with the calculating expression that had made him dangerous for decades. If telepathy doesn't work, what does that leave us? Conventional leverage, information asymmetry, strategic positioning. The same tools we've always used, just applied to a subject who won't be swayed by emotional manipulation or mental coercion. Emma set down her glass, her professional mask fully restored. "We give him data, we observe his decision-making processes, and we position ourselves as the rational alternative to both Orcus's aggression and the X-Men's moralism. And when he inevitably does something at the gala that creates an international incident," Emma's smile returned colder and sharper than before. "Then we'll have front-row seats to watching the world's power structures try to contain something they fundamentally don't understand. Either way, we win. Either he remains controllable through information exchange, or he becomes the catalyst that forces complete restructuring of how this world handles enhanced individuals. Both outcomes serve our long-term interests." She didn't mention the other possibility that Accelerator would decide the Hellfire Club, like every other faction he'd encountered, was simply noise in an equation he'd already solved. That he'd take the information offered and vanish into whatever trajectory his calculations deemed optimal, leaving them with nothing but the memory of briefly holding his attention. That possibility kept her awake for the next 72 hours, reviewing strategy, refining approaches, preparing for a gala that would either cement the Hellfire Club's position as power brokers in a changing world, or expose them as just another group that had misunderstood what they were dealing with. 3 days. Then they'd know which outcome mathematics favored. In a command center beneath Manhattan, Dr. Killian reviewed the same intelligence Emma Frost had accessed, though through significantly less elegant channels. Orcus's surveillance network had flagged the rooftop meeting facial recognition, identifying the Hellfire Club's White Queen within seconds of her arrival. "The Hellfire Club is making contact," an analyst reported, highlighting the relevant data streams. "Intelligence suggests they're offering information access in exchange for gala attendance." Killian studied the footage, watching body language that suggested negotiation rather than confrontation. "And our asset. What's his response profile?" "Engaged but not committed. He's gathering data about faction structures, political landscapes. Every interaction is information collection for him. No emotional investment detected." "Perfect," Killian said, a plan crystallizing with the clarity that came from understanding an opponent's psychology. Let the Hellfire Club think they're being clever. Let them provide him data, give him access. The more information he has about mutant power structures, the better he'll serve our purposes. The analyst looked confused. Sir, I don't understand. If he's learning about mutant capabilities, he's learning about weaknesses. Killian interrupted. Every power structure has fault lines, pressure points where the whole system becomes vulnerable. The Gala will concentrate Omega-level mutants in one location, creating the perfect demonstration of why our Sentinel programs are necessary. And our anomalous friend will provide the catalyst, whether he intends to or not. He pulled up classified files on the Omega Threshold project specifications that made even seasoned Orcas operatives nervous. The technology had been in development for months. Theoretical models refined through countless simulations. Accelerator simply provided the justification to move from testing to deployment. Accelerate the threshold timeline, Killian ordered. I want it operational before the Gala. We've been building toward this, now we have our catalyst. If we're going to demonstrate the necessity of technological containment, we need the threat to be undeniable. And nothing says undeniable threat quite like an Omega-level individual pushed past their breaking point in front of the world's cameras. The analyst hesitated. Sir, the Ethical Review Board hasn't approved field deployment. The risk of collateral. The Ethical Review Board answers to people who understand that difficult decisions are necessary for species survival. Killian set his tone, allowing no argument. Accelerator has already demonstrated he's beyond conventional containment. The X-Men failed. Standard Sentinel protocols failed. We need proof that our advanced systems work where everything else doesn't. The Gala provides that proof. He closed the files with finality, his decision made, with the same cold calculation that Accelerator would have recognized and possibly respected. Alert all threshold teams, 3 days to operational readiness. And increase surveillance on the Hellfire Club's communications. I want to know everything they're offering him, every piece of intelligence they think gives them leverage. The command center hummed with renewed activity analysts and technicians, working to compress weeks of testing into 72 hours. Somewhere in the mechanical efficiency ethical concerns were filed away as acceptable costs of strategic necessity. 3 days. Then the world would see what happened when you tried to negotiate with mathematics. In Westchester, Charles Xavier felt the subtle shift in probability, the sense that events were accelerating toward convergence. His telepathy couldn't reach Accelerator directly, but he could feel the ripples spreading through the psychic landscape. Emma's carefully controlled anxiety, Orcus's cold calculation, the city's ambient fear, slowly curdling into acceptance. Scott, he said into the communicator, his voice heavy with concern, earned through decades of watching good intentions collide with harsh reality. I believe we're running out of time. The Hellfire Club has made contact, and Orcus is planning something for the Gala. We need to accelerate our own preparations. Preparations for what? Scott's question carried the exhaustion of someone who had already lost one engagement and wasn't confident about the next. For the moment when talking stops being an option, Xavier replied, the admission tasting like defeat. I've spent my life believing that understanding and communication could solve any conflict. But I'm not certain those principles apply to someone who views communication as nothing more than data transfer. We may need to accept that some problems can't be solved through dialogue. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Scott Summers had built his entire leadership philosophy around making impossible choices in service of survival. Hearing Xavier admit the limits of his own approach was like watching a foundation crack. I'll have the team ready, Scott said finally. Whatever happens at that gala, we'll be prepared to contain the fallout. Though I'm not sure prepared means what it used to. None of us are, Xavier agreed. That's what makes the next 3 days so dangerous. We're all preparing for battles we don't fully understand against an opponent who's already solved the equation we're still trying to write. He closed the connection and sat in silence, his vast telepathic awareness spreading across the globe like a net cast into deep water. Somewhere in that network of consciousness patterns were forming Orcus's cold calculation, the Hellfire Club's strategic maneuvering, the X-Men's determined preparation. And at the center of it all, a void where human thought should be. A consciousness that processed rather than felt, calculated rather than chose, existed rather than lived. 3 days until the Hellfire Gala. 3 days until controlled variables became chaos. 3 days until the world learned that some equations solved themselves, regardless of what the participants wanted. Mathematics, after all, never cared about intentions, only results. The Sentinel descended from low orbit at 0400 hours. Its entry trajectory calculated to minimize atmospheric friction while maximizing psychological impact. Orbital surveillance had tracked the target to an abandoned industrial complex in Brooklyn, and Orcus Command had given authorization for full adaptive engagement protocols. This wasn't a standard Sentinel unit. The designation read Nimrod Prime, and its programming represented decades of research into self-evolving combat algorithms. Where previous models followed rigid tactical flowcharts, Nimrod learned. Every engagement refined its operational parameters, every failure strengthened its strategic database. Dr. Killian watched the deployment from Orcus Command, surrounded by displays showing real-time telemetry threat assessments and probability matrices that shifted as new data streamed in. Around him, analysts maintained careful silence, aware that this field test carried implications beyond simple threat containment. Nimrod is entering engagement range, a tactical coordinator reported. Initial scan confirms target presence. Energy signature matches previous encounters. Adaptive countermeasures are online and ready for pattern recognition. Killian leaned forward, his attention fixed on the primary display. Remember, this isn't about destroying the target. We need data. Combat duration adaptation speed breaking points. The Omega threshold requires precise calibration, and we won't get that from corpses or craters. The Sentinel touched down half a mile from Accelerator's position, its landing creating tremors that registered on seismic monitors across 3 boroughs. Standard protocol would have been immediate engagement, overwhelming force, applied before the target could establish defensive positioning. Nimrod had different priorities. It stood motionless for 17 seconds. Sensors sweeping the environment with precision that exceeded human perception by orders of magnitude. Electromagnetic spectrum analysis, thermal imaging, gravitational anomaly detection, every available input fed into processing cores that had been designed with a single purpose: learn faster than the opponent could adapt. More importantly, it deployed micro-beacons across a 100-meter radius, each device smaller than a coin and designed to map spatial vector patterns. Not weapons measurement tools. The grid would record how force behaved in proximity to the target, building a 3-dimensional model of the reflection field's operational boundaries. Accelerator emerged from the industrial building with the unhurried pace of someone expecting interruption. His expression carried the same neutral assessment it had shown during every previous encounter, as if giant robots descending from orbit were routine background events. Unit designation Nimrod. The Sentinel announced its voice, carrying none of the mechanical flatness of earlier models. The audio profile had been tuned to suggest intelligence rather than automation. A psychological warfare decision based on research showing enhanced individuals responded differently to opponents they perceived as conscious. The Sentinel paused 0.3 of a second, processing Accelerator's postural response latency before adjusting its vocal cadence mid-sentence. You have been classified as an Omega-level threat, requiring immediate containment. Compliance will minimize damage to surrounding infrastructure. Accelerator stopped 20 meters away, head tilted in that characteristic gesture that suggested data processing rather than emotional consideration. New hardware, different approach, Show me what you learned from the last ones. Nimrod's combat algorithms registered the response no fear. No aggression, just clinical interest. The target was treating this as an experiment rather than a survival situation. Tactical assessment upgraded standard intimidation protocols would be ineffective. The Sentinel's first attack came without further warning. Plasma cannons charged and fired in synchronized sequence energy beams, tracking predicted evasion vectors with microsecond precision. The assault pattern had been refined through analysis of previous Sentinel failures, each targeting solution designed to account for vector manipulation capabilities. The plasma redirected mid-flight inverted trajectories, sending superheated energy screaming back toward its source. But Nimrod had planned for this. The Sentinel's armor plating reconfigured in the instant before impact. Angled surfaces designed to disperse reflected attacks across maximum area. The plasma washed over its chassis like water over stone, dissipating into the atmosphere as waste heat rather than concentrated destruction. Adaptation confirmed, Killian murmured, watching the exchange with satisfaction. It's not trying to overpower the reflection, it's accepting the redirect and managing the consequences. Nimrod pressed forward, each step calculated to maintain optimal engagement distance, while minimizing predictable approach vectors. Its next assault came from multiple angles, simultaneously kinetic projectiles from shoulder-mounted launchers, electromagnetic pulses from torso-integrated emitters, and directed energy weapons firing in staggered sequence. But the sequence wasn't random. 2 of the kinetic rounds were deliberately miscalculated trajectory errors that no military-grade system should make. Nimrod recorded precisely how Accelerator's field corrected those vectors, measuring the direction and magnitude of each adjustment. The data populated predictive models in real time. If the field corrected trajectory X by angle Y, then assault pattern Z should arrive along the reflection path, forcing either more complex calculations or revealing processing priorities. Accelerator's reflection field handled the diversity without apparent strain. Projectiles reversed course, electromagnetic pulses, inverted polarity energy beams bent back toward their source. But Nimrod had already reconfigured armor sections, repositioning to absorb reflected attacks, while secondary systems tracked the precise mathematics of each vector manipulation. Learning, Killian realized. It was recording the exact parameters of how Accelerator's ability functioned, building a predictive model in real time. The Sentinel shifted tactics again this time, abandoning direct attacks in favor of environmental manipulation. Its arm-mounted cannons fired not at Accelerator, but at the industrial buildings surrounding him, calculating collapse patterns that would create kinetic debris from angles the reflection field would need to process simultaneously. Concrete and steel fell in orchestrated chaos, tons of material descending from multiple vectors. Accelerator's field redirected the debris, sending it spiraling outward in patterns that turned potential crushing force into an expanding sphere of high-velocity projectiles. Nimrod weathered the storm, its armor absorbing impacts that would have destroyed conventional Sentinels. But more importantly, it was gathering data measurements of how the field distributed force across multiple simultaneous threats. The computational limits of processing hundreds of vectors at once, the microsecond delays between detection and redirection. Engagement duration 3 minutes 17 seconds, an analyst reported. Nimrod has sustained moderate damage, but maintains combat effectiveness. Target shows no signs of strain or degraded capability. Killian studied the telemetry, watching probability matrices shift as Nimrod's learning algorithms refined their models. How long until it achieves predictive accuracy? Current projection, 12 to 15 minutes of sustained engagement. The more attacks it processes, the more precise its vector manipulation model becomes. On the ground, Accelerator had stopped moving. His attention focused entirely on Nimrod, red eyes tracking the Sentinel's tactical evolution with something approaching genuine interest. This opponent was different from the others. It adapted, learned, refined its approach based on observed outcomes. Inefficient design for immediate victory. Accelerator assessed. Optimal for long-term strategic development. The machine prioritized data collection over dominance, which suggested controllers who understood the value of information. Nimrod launched another assault, but this time the attack pattern showed subtle shifts. Plasma beams arrived at intervals calculated to stress the reflection field's processing capacity. Each subsequent attack landing fractionally faster than the one before. Kinetic projectiles came from angles that required more complex vector calculations to redirect. Electromagnetic pulses pulsed at frequencies designed to test the limits of what the field could manipulate. The Sentinel was probing for breaking points, searching for the threshold where capability met limitation. Accelerator's expression shifted microscopically, not quite approval, but recognition of competent opposition. He extended one hand, and the atmospheric pressure within a 100-meter radius inverted. Nimrod's sensors screamed warnings as the air itself became a weapon. The Sentinel activated emergency counterpressure protocols, internal bracing systems, engaging to resist the crushing force. For 3.7 seconds, its structural integrity held hydraulic reinforcements, buying time for its sensors to record atmospheric vector patterns. Pressure differential ratios. The precise mathematical relationships governing the manipulation. Then, the tolerances exceeded. Wind that should have dispersed outward compressed inward, creating pressure gradients that overwhelmed even military-grade engineering. Metal shrieked as forces it had briefly resisted finally bent armor plating inward, deforming the chassis into sculptural ruin. But the Sentinel didn't retreat. Even as its chassis deformed, its learning algorithms continued recording data. Wind vector patterns, pressure differentials, the precise mathematical relationships governing atmospheric manipulation. All of it fed into databases that would survive, even if the hardware didn't. Killian watched structural integrity warnings flash across his displays. Nimrod tactical assessment. Can you achieve mission objectives? The response came immediately transmitted through encrypted channels, even as the Sentinel's physical form continued degrading. Negative. Target capability exceeds sustainable engagement parameters. However, sufficient data has been collected for preliminary predictive modeling. Recommendation: tactical withdrawal with full data transmission. Continue engagement to terminal failure. Killian set his tone, carrying no more emotion than if he were ordering equipment maintenance. Data redundancy confirmed. Unit loss acceptable. We need ceiling measurements, not survival projections. There was no protest, no hesitation. Nimrod had been programmed with clear priorities. Data collection superseded unit preservation. The Sentinel reconfigured its remaining functional systems, redirecting power from damaged components to sensors and transmission arrays. If it was going to be destroyed, it would make that destruction maximally educational. The next wave of attacks came with mechanical determination. Each assault designed not for damage, but for information extraction. Nimrod fired at frequencies meant to test the reflection field's spectral range. It generated electromagnetic interference across the entire usable spectrum, probing for gaps in coverage. It deployed micro-projectiles at hypersonic velocities, searching for the speed threshold where vector calculation couldn't keep pace with incoming threats. Accelerator processed each attack with methodical precision, his reflection field redirecting forces that should have leveled city blocks. But something in his posture suggested engagement beyond mere defensive response. The Sentinel's approach interested him. The willingness to accept destruction in service of data collection resonated with principles he understood. You're not trying to win. Accelerator observed his voice carrying across the battlefield with unnatural clarity. You're trying to learn. Different priority structure than the others. Nimrod's audio sensors registered the comment, but offered no response. Its programming didn't include capacity for tactical banter, only combat optimization and information gathering. Another salvo erupted from its damaged weapons systems, kinetic rounds and plasma beams arriving in sequences calculated to maximum analytical value. The reflection field handled them with familiar efficiency. But Nimrod's sensors caught something crucial. A microsecond delay in processing too brief to create vulnerability, but present nonetheless. More importantly, the delay scaled. 10 simultaneous vectors created negligible lag. 50 vectors introduced measurable hesitation. The relationship wasn't linear, suggesting computational overhead increased geometrically with input complexity. Data point logged, transmission priority elevated. Back in Orcus Command, analysts watched the telemetry with growing excitement. "We're seeing it," one of them reported, highlighting specific metrics on the shared displays. "Nimrod's pushing him into higher computational loads. Nothing close to limits yet, but we're establishing baseline parameters for what extended engagement looks like." Killian studied the data with predatory focus. "How does this translate to omega threshold projections? We'll need to process the full data set, but preliminary analysis suggests his vector manipulation requires active calculation for each threat. If we can generate sufficient simultaneous vectors, thousands of discrete inputs arriving faster than he can process, we might create windows of vulnerability." "Not vulnerabilities," Killian corrected. "Optimization opportunities. We don't need to defeat him. We just need to stress his capabilities enough that the threshold can force an evolution event. Push him past his current operational limits and into territory where he becomes unstable." On the battlefield, Nimrod was entering terminal failure mode. Its armor had been reduced to shrapnel. By atmospheric forces, it couldn't counter internal system shorting, as the pressure differentials Accelerator generated exceeded engineering tolerances. But even in death, it served its purpose. The Sentinel's final assault came from its core reactor, a deliberately induced overload designed to generate an explosion that would test how the reflection field handled energy release from point-blank range. Nimrod's processors calculated the optimal detonation yield enough force to be analytically valuable. Calibrated to remain within the abandoned industrial zone Orcus had quietly evacuated 12 hours prior. No civilian grid intersections within blast radius. Maximum data value. Minimal political complications. Accelerator recognized the self-destruct sequence 3 seconds before initiation. He could have put distance between himself and the imminent detonation. Instead, he remained in position, curious about what the machine hoped to accomplish through its own destruction. The reactor breached an expanding sphere of plasma and radiation, enough energy to vaporize several city blocks released in microseconds. Accelerator's reflection field inverted the blast vectors, converting the outward explosion into an implosion that collapsed back on itself. The energy that should have created a crater instead compressed into a sphere of contained force temperatures that should have melted steel, trapped in a mathematical prison of redirected vectors. Then he released it, allowing the compressed energy to dissipate upward in a column of superheated air that punched through cloud cover like a spear thrown at heaven. The spectacle lasted 7 seconds. When it ended, only scorched earth remained where Nimrod had stood, the Sentinel's physical form vaporized by the forces it had unleashed. But its final act had succeeded. In the microseconds before total destruction, Nimrod had transmitted its complete combat database to Orcus Command. Every measurement, every observation, every failed attack pattern and successful data collection sequence. The hardware was gone, but the knowledge endured. Killian reviewed the incoming data stream, watching gigabytes of information populate analysis servers. Combat duration vector manipulation patterns, energy handling capacities, atmospheric control parameters, all of it recorded with precision that human observers could never achieve. Full database received and processing, an analyst confirmed. Nimrod achieved primary mission objectives before termination. We have baseline data for omega threshold calibration. Begin immediate analysis, Killian ordered. I want preliminary models ready within 12 hours. The gala is in 48 hours, and I need to know exactly what inputs will push him past controlled capability into useful instability. Around him, the command center shifted into high-intensity operation teams, working to extract strategic value from Nimrod's sacrifice. The Sentinel had lasted less than 11 minutes against Accelerator, but those 11 minutes had provided more actionable intelligence than weeks of passive observation. On the Brooklyn industrial grounds, Accelerator stood in the center of scorched concrete, his expression unchanged despite the engagement that had just concluded. The Sentinel had been more interesting than previous opponents. Its willingness to sacrifice itself for information collection suggested controllers who understood priorities beyond immediate victory. He processed the implications, calculating what the machine's data would tell its masters. They would learn about his capabilities, certainly, but they would also reveal their own priorities, their strategic thinking, their willingness to expend resources for knowledge. Information flowed both directions. They studied him, but in doing so, they taught him about themselves. Useful Accelerator concluded. The next encounter would benefit from this exchange. He turned and walked away from the destruction, already modeling what approaches Orcus would attempt based on what Nimrod had learned. The equation was becoming clearer variables, resolving into patterns he could predict and counter. In Westchester, alerts screamed across the X-Men's tactical displays. Cerebro had detected the energy spike from Brooklyn, the brief but intense burst of power that accompanied Nimrod's final detonation. Scott Summers stood in the war room studying satellite imagery of the aftermath with growing concern. Orcus deployed a next-generation Sentinel as a beast, reported his analysis, pulling data from multiple sources. Not a containment unit, a learning platform designed for combat evolution. It engaged for approximately 11 minutes before self-destructing. Casualties? Scott's question came sharp, dreading the answer. None detected. The engagement occurred in an abandoned industrial zone, and the target Accelerator appears to have contained the terminal explosion rather than allowing it to propagate. Beast pulled up additional telemetry, his scientific curiosity warring with ethical discomfort. Scott, this is significant. Orcus just demonstrated they're willing to sacrifice million-dollar military hardware purely for reconnaissance value. They're not trying to defeat him anymore. They're studying him. Storm entered the war room, her expression troubled. Charles has been attempting to reach out to Orcus leadership through diplomatic channels. They're refusing all communication. Whatever they're planning, they've moved past the point where external input would change their course. Scott stared at the satellite images, seeing the precision of the destruction, the controlled nature of what should have been chaotic devastation. He's getting stronger. Not in raw power, he's learning tactical sophistication. The Nimrod engagement taught him that this world has opponents who think strategically, who prioritize information over immediate victory. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Or it makes him more predictable, Jean said, joining the discussion. She'd been monitoring the situation through her telepathic senses, feeling the psychic reverberations of the Brooklyn engagement. If he values information, then we know what currency to use in future interactions. Knowledge becomes leverage. That's Hellfire Club thinking, Scott replied, not quite criticism, but close. We're not politicians, we're supposed to be better than using people as game pieces. And how's that moral superiority working out? The question came from Logan, who'd been listening from the doorway. We tried the high road in our first engagement, got our asses handed to us and gave Orcus perfect footage for their propaganda machine. Maybe it's time we accept that some situations don't have clean solutions. The tension in the room crystallized around competing philosophies that had fractured the X-Men before. Scott's belief in strategic necessity versus the idealistic approach that had defined Xavier's dream for decades. Storm's commitment to protecting the innocent balanced against Logan's pragmatic acceptance of harsh realities. Jean standing between extremes, trying to find wisdom in the spaces neither side wanted to acknowledge. "The Hellfire Gala is in 2 days," Scott said, finally, his voice carrying the weight of leadership that sometimes felt like drowning. Emma Frost invited him as her guest, which means we'll all be in the same location for the first time since this began. Orcus will be watching. The media will be circling. And we'll have every Omega-level mutant in one place. While a non-mutant Orcus wants to label as one of us, demonstrates capabilities we can't counter. "So what's the play?" Logan asked. Scott studied the satellite imagery for a long moment before answering. "We do what we always do. We protect civilians, we prevent escalation, and we try to save everyone even when the smart money says we can't. Because the moment we start calculating acceptable losses is the moment we become exactly what Orcus claims we are. And if that's not enough..." Storm's question held no judgment, just recognition of reality. "Then we live with the consequences and do better next time," Scott replied. "I don't know how to beat someone who treats physics as a suggestion and morality as irrelevant variables. But I know how to be an X-Man when it matters most. That'll have to be enough." He turned to the tactical displays, making decisions that would shape their approach to the gala. "Beast, I need you working with our legal team. Orcus is jamming Cerebro and spoofing genetic data. We need documentation ready for when their narrative collapses. Storm, coordinate with Emma Frost. I know it's uncomfortable, but if telepathy can't shut him down, it can disrupt his decision-making. You'll need her precision. Logan, Nightcrawler. Kitty, start running scenarios for breaking tactical anchor points. If he calculates vectors, we need to eliminate the stable reference frames he's using. The assignments created momentum, transformed abstract worry into concrete preparation. Not a solution, but a direction. The war room settled into tense silence, each person processing implications and preparing for scenarios that felt increasingly like no-win situations. Outside, the sun climbed toward afternoon, counting down hours to a gala that would either prove the X-Men's relevance or expose them as relics of thinking that no longer applied. In his secure facility beneath Manhattan, Killian watched processing algorithms extract patterns from Nimrod's final data transmission. The models were preliminary, incomplete, but already they suggested possibilities that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. "Sir, preliminary threshold calibrations are complete," an analyst reported. "Based on Nimrod's combat data, we can generate multi-vector stress patterns that will push the target toward computational overload. Not enough to defeat him, but sufficient to force evolution beyond his current stability threshold." Killian studied the projections, seeing probability curves that bent toward exactly the outcome he'd engineered. And collateral projections, manageable if we control the engagement location. The gala venue has been selected for structural reinforcement and strategic positioning. We can contain immediate blast effects while ensuring maximum media coverage of the instability event. "Perfect," Killian murmured, his satisfaction cold and absolute. "We're not trying to destroy him. We're demonstrating why enhanced individuals, especially Omega-level threats, require technological containment that only Sentinel programs can provide. Nimrod's sacrifice gives us the blueprint, the threshold gives us the stage, and the gala gives us the audience." He pulled up security footage of the Brooklyn engagement, watching Accelerator walk away from destruction with that same neutral expression, that same clinical detachment from events that should have provoked emotional response. "You think you're collecting data about us," Killian said to the screen. "But every second you spend learning our capabilities, we're learning yours. And unlike you, we understand that information warfare requires sacrifice." The command center hummed with preparation. 48 hours of refinement and calibration compressed into a timeline that left no room for hesitation or ethical review. Somewhere in the mechanical efficiency, the question of whether they should became irrelevant, next to the certainty that they could. 2 days until the Hellfire Gala. 2 days until Orcus proved that human ingenuity could contain any threat given sufficient data and willingness to pay necessary costs. 2 days until mathematics met engineering and the world discovered which discipline wrote the rules. Accelerator stood on a different rooftop now, watching the city flow through its rhythms of commerce and survival. The Nimrod engagement had been educational confirmation that this world's factions understood information asymmetry and strategic sacrifice. They were learning which made them moderately less predictable than purely reactive opponents. The Hellfire Gala approached. Emma Frost's offer of information access remained valid, a transaction he'd agreed to, because the data held value. But he'd also processed what the invitation really represented. Concentration of enhanced individuals in a controlled environment, multiple factions converging with competing agendas. Probability of conflict escalation, approaching statistical certainty. They were building towards something. Orchestrating convergence for purposes beyond what they'd explicitly stated. The pattern recognition was elementary. Create pressure, observe responses, use resulting data to refine future operations. He would attend. Not because the Hellfire Club's motives aligned with his objectives, but because the data density of that convergence point exceeded anything random observation could provide. Whatever they were planning would teach him more about this world's power structures than weeks of passive analysis. And if their plans required his participation in ways they hadn't disclosed well, they would learn the same lesson everyone else had learned. You couldn't manipulate variables you didn't understand. And they didn't understand him yet. 2 days. Then the equation would progress to its next phase, and all parties would discover whether their calculations held under pressure. Mathematics didn't negotiate. It simply solved itself regardless of what participants wanted the answer to be. Eric Lenscher had seen the footage 17 times before deciding to act. Each viewing revealed new details, the precise economy of movement, the absolute certainty with which this anomaly treated physical law as negotiable framework rather than immutable constraint. The way sentinels destroyed themselves against their own reflected force. How the X-Men's powers became liabilities the moment they engaged. The cold efficiency with which atmospheric pressure bent to mathematical will. He stood now in the ruins of an old steel mill outside Pittsburgh, surrounded by the bones of industry that had once represented America's strength. Rust covered everything oxidation-claiming metal that had been forged in fires hot enough to reshape matter itself. The irony wasn't lost on him, standing among failed transformations while preparing to confront something that seemed to transcend transformation entirely. The mill's magnetic signature called to him like a symphony only he could hear. Tons of ferrous material structural beams, still carrying enough metallic purity to respond to his will. If conversation failed, and he suspected it would, this environment provided resources that purely organic battlefields couldn't offer. Accelerator arrived exactly on time, which told Eric something important this entity understood. Appointment keeping not as courtesy, but as optimal resource allocation. No wasted motion, no dramatic entrance. One moment the far end of the mill floor was empty, the next it contained a figure whose white clothing seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Eric Lenscher. Accelerator said the name delivered with the inflection of someone reading data from a screen. Magnetic field manipulation? Political leader, terrorist, ideologue, depending on whose narrative framework you reference. You want something, state it. No preamble, no tactical positioning. Just direct inquiry stripped of social convention. Eric had spent decades learning to read opponents through their approach patterns, the way they carried themselves, the masks they wore. This one wore no mask, because it apparently didn't understand the concept of concealment. "I want to understand what you are," Eric replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd asked that question about himself countless times. "You're not a mutant despite what Orcus claims. The genetic signature is a contamination from multiversal transit, not X gene expression. So the question becomes, what are you and why are you here? Irrelevant questions, Accelerator said, but didn't leave. His attention focused on Eric with clinical precision. Better question, why does a political revolutionary approach an unknown variable with conversation instead of elimination? Eric felt the familiar pull of magnetic fields, the constant awareness of every ferrous atom within his range. The mill's infrastructure responded to his unconscious will like an extension of his nervous system. Because elimination would make me exactly what my enemies claim I am. Because I've seen what happens when fear drives decision-making. And because you interest me. Interest? Emotion-driven curiosity? Non-optimal motivation for contact with potential threat. Accelerator tilted his head in that characteristic gesture that suggested processing rather than consideration. But you're here anyway. Contradiction between stated philosophy and action suggests hidden variables. What do you actually want? The directness was disarming in its purity. No manipulation, no tactical misdirection, just algorithmic analysis seeking to resolve discrepancies in observed behavior. Eric had negotiated with presidents and warlords, faced down gods and monsters. None of them had approached conversation like a debugging process. I want to prevent what's coming, Eric said, choosing honesty because anything else would be wasted effort. The Hellfire Gala is in 36 hours. 3 major factions will converge in one location: mutant leadership, human political interests, and you. Orcus is planning something likely using you as a catalyst for demonstrating why enhanced individuals require technological containment. And when it goes wrong, my people will pay the price, regardless of who's actually responsible. Probability assessment accurate? Accelerator replied. Orcus is preparing a device they call Omega Threshold, designed to force convergence between high-energy signatures. Their Nimrod unit collected sufficient data about my vector manipulation to calibrate targeting parameters. The Gala provides optimal concentration of targets and media coverage. Standard trap architecture. Eric's expression didn't change, but internally, he recalculated his entire approach. This entity had already analyzed the strategic landscape, identified the trap, and apparently planned to walk into it anyway. If you know it's a trap, traps are information-dense environments, Accelerator interrupted. They reveal capabilities, priorities, tactical thinking that passive observation can't provide. Orcus wants to test my limits. I want to test theirs. The exchange is mutually beneficial regardless of which party believes they're in control. At the cost of how many lives? The question emerged sharper than Eric intended, decades of protective fury bleeding through calculated composure. Accelerator's expression didn't shift. Lives are variables in the equation. I don't optimize for casualties because I don't optimize for prevention. Harm is a consequence of force interaction, not a decision criterion. You're asking the wrong question again. Eric felt something cold settle in his chest. Recognition of a worldview so fundamentally alien. The common ground might not exist. He'd faced supremacists who viewed mutants as subhuman governments that saw enhanced individuals as weapons to be controlled. But those opponents at least operated within frameworks of fear, hate power, human emotions he could understand, even when opposing them. This was different. This was mathematics claiming consciousness, logic wearing flesh, a calculator that happened to be self-aware. Then let me ask the right question, Eric said, his voice dropping to the quiet intensity that had preceded some of his most consequential decisions. If harm is just consequence, if lives are variables, what happens when someone decides you're the variable that needs eliminating? When your optimization creates sufficient threat that the only rational response is your permanent removal. They try, Accelerator replied simply. they fail. The cycle repeats with incrementally refined approaches until they either achieve sufficient understanding to avoid conflict or exhaust available resources. I've observed this pattern multiple times across different factional structures. The outcome is predictable. You're describing extinction, Eric said, magnetic fields beginning to stir in response to his rising tension. Metal groaned as structural beams shifted microscopically, the mill's skeleton responding to emotional input its master hadn't consciously sent. Your presence creates conflict. Conflict escalates. Eventually, someone with sufficient power and desperation decides that peace requires your elimination. Consequences be damned. That's not a cycle, that's a countdown. To what? Accelerator's question held genuine curiosity, the first hint of engagement beyond data collection that Eric had detected. You're proposing I'll eventually encounter force I can't redirect. Based on what calculation? Eric extended his hand, and the mill responded like an orchestra to its conductor. Beams tore free from ancient moorings, tons of steel rising into patterns that defied gravity's insistence. Not an attack, a demonstration. The metal moved with precision that matched Accelerator's own economy of motion, each piece finding position in a growing sphere of controlled force. Based on this, Eric said, the metal sphere rotating around them, both like a planet forming from stellar debris. I can sense every atom of ferrous material within a mile. I can manipulate magnetic fields at the subatomic level, restructure metal's crystalline lattice, generate electromagnetic pulses that would cook conventional biology like meat in a microwave. And I'm not even the strongest mutant alive. The sphere contracted, thousands of tons of steel compressing toward the center where Accelerator stood. Eric watched, carefully measuring the response, testing whether this entity's confidence was justified or merely untested. The metal stopped 3 meters from Accelerator's position, motion arrested, as if striking invisible barrier. But Eric felt the resistance, not a wall, but redirection. The magnetic forces he'd applied were being inverted vectors rotating through angles that made his decades of practice control feel like crude approximation. Lorentz force. Accelerator observed his tone, suggesting he was cataloging rather than defending. Electromagnetic field interaction with charged particles. You're manipulating the second-order effects field curvature, polarity, attraction, repulsion dynamics. Elegant implementation, but still vector-based physics. Still mathematics I can process. The sphere's contraction reversed steel beams flying outward as Eric's own power turned against him. He redirected the reflected force, caught the metal before it could demolish what remained of the mill's walls. The exchange lasted 3 seconds. Attack, reflection, recovery. 3 seconds that proved Accelerator's claim wasn't arrogance, but assessment. Eric let the metal settle beams, returning to rest positions with far less grace than they'd departed. His breathing remained controlled, but he felt the familiar burn in his muscles that came from pushing magnetic manipulation to its limits. Not exhaustion, just the cost of moving that much mass, that precisely while compensating for unexpected reflection. Point made, Eric acknowledged. You can counter my abilities the same way you've countered everyone else's. But that's not actually the point I was making. Explain. Eric gestured at the mill around them, the rust and decay, the monument to obsolescence. This place was built by people who believed steel was strength. They were wrong, or rather they were right for a specific era that eventually ended. Power that doesn't adapt becomes liability. You've adapted to every threat you've encountered so far by being better at mathematics than your opponents. But mathematics isn't the only language the universe speaks. Incorrect. Accelerator replied with the certainty of someone stating observational fact. Mathematics is the only objective language. Everything else is interpretation layered over quantifiable reality. Force, energy, momentum, probability, all expressible as equations. Your magnetic manipulation is mathematical. The X-Men's powers are mathematical. Even Orcus's trap is mathematical. That I speak this language better than my opponents isn't adaptation. It's recognition of fundamental truth. And yet you're here talking to me instead of simply eliminating a potential obstacle, Eric countered. That suggests you recognize value in non-mathematical exchange, information that can't be reduced to vectors and calculations. Accelerator was silent for a moment, the first genuine pause Eric had observed since the conversation began. When he spoke again, his tone carried something that might have been acknowledgement if such concepts applied. You're not an obstacle, you're a data point. Your magnetic manipulation demonstrates this world has individuals capable of large-scale force manipulation with precision comparable to my own methods. Your willingness to engage in conversation, despite recognizing trap architecture, suggests factional leadership that prioritizes strategic information over immediate tactical advantage. Your emotional investment in protection of your people creates predictable constraints on action radius that future calculations can exploit. The clinical dissection of his motivations should have been infuriating. Instead, Eric found himself almost appreciating the honesty. At least this entity didn't pretend to care while manipulating emotional vulnerabilities. So I'm useful to you, Eric said. For now. What happens when that utility expires? You continue existing unless you generate sufficient interference to require elimination. Standard resource management. Accelerator's gaze shifted to the sky beyond the mill's broken ceiling, tracking something Eric couldn't perceive. This conversation has extracted available data. Continuing would be redundant. You should withdraw to safety radius before the gala. Probability of cascade failure during Orcus intervention is 73%. It was a warning. Delivered with all the emotional weight of a weather forecast, but a warning nonetheless. Eric processed the implications this entity had calculated the Orcus trap's failure probability, and was sharing that information despite no apparent strategic benefit from doing so. Why tell me that? Eric asked. If you don't optimize for casualties, why warn me to protect my people? Because your presence at the gala introduces complexity that reduces data quality. Accelerator replied. If you attempt intervention during Orcus's trap deployment, you'll create additional variables that complicate environmental measurements. Your absence optimizes for cleaner experimental results. The answer was perfectly logical, perfectly inhuman, and somehow perfectly honest. Eric had spent his life fighting for mutant survival against opponents who viewed his people as threats, resources, or acceptable losses. This entity viewed them as experimental noise, neither valued nor hated, simply irrelevant to the calculations that mattered. He didn't know if that was better or worse. I won't abandon my people to give you cleaner data, Eric said, magnetic fields stirring again in response to conviction that had shaped his entire life. Whatever Orcus is planning, whatever you're planning, mutants will be there because the gala represents everything we've fought to build. Hope, legitimacy, a future where we're not defined solely by fear. I won't let that be destroyed because it complicates your experiments. Suboptimal decision. Accelerator observed. Your intervention will increase casualties among the population you're trying to protect. Statistical probability approaches certainty. Then I'll deal with those consequences, Eric replied. That's what leadership means, accepting responsibility for outcomes even when the mathematics say you're wrong. Even when cold logic suggests abandonment is the optimal choice. Because my people aren't variables to be optimized. They're the reason the equation matters in the first place. Accelerator studied him with that unnerving focus that felt like being cataloged. Philosophy. You're prioritizing abstract principle over measurable outcome. Inefficient but consistent with observed behavioral patterns. Your decision is noted and incorporated into probability matrices. Without further comment, Accelerator turned and walked away. His form disappearing among the mill's shadows with the same absence of ceremony that had marked his arrival. One moment present, the next, simply gone, leaving Eric alone among the rust and steel. Eric remained still for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. He'd come seeking understanding, hoping to find some leverage point, some weakness in this entity's approach that could prevent catastrophe. Instead, he'd found a mirror that reflected his own principles back as mathematical inefficiency, a consciousness that treated morality as irrelevant variable noise. The magnetic field settled around him, metal returning to dormancy. He pulled out a secure communicator, opening a channel to the one person who needed to hear this assessment immediately. "Charles," he said when the connection established, "we have a problem. A bigger one than we thought." Xavier's voice came through with the careful neutrality that preceded difficult conversations. "You've made contact with him?" "Yes. And I've confirmed what we suspected. He's not a mutant, not even close to our operational framework. But that's not the problem. The problem is that he's analyzed the gala situation, identified the trap, calculated its failure probability, and plans to attend anyway. He views the entire event as an experiment to test limits, his and ours. Can he be reasoned with?" Eric looked at the mill around him, seeing the metaphor in the decay. "He can be negotiated with if you speak in terms of data exchange and optimal outcomes. But reasoned with, that would require him to value things beyond calculations. And I'm not sure he does." "Then we need to prepare for worst-case scenarios," Xavier said, his telepathic presence carrying weight that radio couldn't convey. "Scott's been coordinating tactical preparations. Storm is working with Emma Frost on psychic disruption protocols. We'll do everything we can to protect civilians and minimize casualties." "It won't be enough," Eric said quietly. "I could feel it, Charles. The absolute certainty with which he processes reality. We're trying to win a philosophical argument against someone who doesn't acknowledge philosophy exists. Mathematics doesn't compromise. It just solves itself and moves on. Then we find a way to change the equation," Xavier replied with the stubborn optimism that had defined their decades-long friendship despite fundamental disagreements. "We've faced extinction events before. We've confronted gods and cosmic forces. We've survived because we refused to accept that the mathematics were final. This won't be different." Eric wanted to believe that. Wanted to share Charles's faith that determination and moral clarity could overcome pure computational superiority. But he'd looked into Accelerator's eyes and seen nothing looking back. No hate to exploit, no fear to manipulate, no pride to wound. Just process executing according to parameters that didn't include variables like hope or heroism. "I'll be at the gala," Eric said, instead of voicing his doubts. "Whatever happens, my people deserve to see leadership that doesn't abandon them when the calculations turn unfavorable, even if it's suboptimal." "Especially then," Xavier agreed. "That's what separates us from machines, Eric. The ability to choose meaning over efficiency. To value the equation for the sake of those it describes, not just the elegance of its solution." The connection closed, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts and the magnetic resonance of a steel mill that had outlived its purpose, but refused to completely surrender to entropy. He stood there as sunset painted the ruins in shades of rust and gold, preparing mentally for a confrontation that logic said he should avoid. 36 hours until the gala. 36 hours until they discovered whether human conviction could withstand mathematical certainty, whether ideals meant anything when confronted with cold optimization. Eric suspected he already knew the answer. But suspicion wasn't certainty, and as long as uncertainty existed, fighting was still rational, even if the mathematics disagreed. In a warehouse across the city, Accelerator reviewed the data collected from the Magneto encounter. The magnetic manipulation had been more sophisticated than anticipated. Subatomic level control suggested this world's enhanced individuals had developed capabilities that approached theoretical limits of their respective domains. Interesting. The encounter had refined his predictive models, provided baseline measurements for how ideology constrained tactical decisions, demonstrated that at least one faction leader understood the trap architecture, but would engage anyway due to non-quantifiable priorities. The gala would concentrate these contradictions in a single location. Orcus would attempt to force his evolution through their threshold device, not understanding that forced evolution was still data collection by another name. The X-Men would try to minimize casualties, creating predictable patterns in their response. Magneto would intervene despite knowing intervention was statistically suboptimal. And he would process all of it, learn from every variable, refine his understanding of this world's power structures through the crucible of their own trap. The equation was approaching solution. What remained was observation of how the variables behaved when stressed beyond normal parameters. 36 hours. Then the real experiment began. Mathematics, after all, didn't care about intentions, only results, and the results were inevitable. The Hellfire Gala had transformed Krakoa's shores into something that existed between dream and threat. Crystalline structures rose from the living island itself. Architecture grown rather than built their surfaces, catching sunset light and scattering it across water that had never known pollution. Delegates arrived via portal and conventional transport, like diplomats in formal wear. Enhanced individuals whose very presence redefined what humanity meant. Media crews whose cameras would carry this night's events to billions of screens worldwide. Emma Frost stood at the entrance, her white gown a calculated statement of control amid barely contained chaos. She greeted each arrival with precision that made genuine warmth irrelevant, her telepathic senses mapping the evening's emotional landscape with the attention of a general surveying a battlefield. Because that's what this was, regardless of the champagne and diplomatic pleasantries. A battlefield where reputation replaced ordnance, where a single misstep could detonate political consequences that would echo for years. "Smile, Emma," Sebastian Shaw murmured, appearing at her shoulder with a drink he hadn't asked for. "You're supposed to project confidence, not calculate casualties." "I'm doing both," Emma replied, accepting the glass without looking at him. Her attention tracked the crowd, noting alliances and tensions, reading body language that told stories the guests thought they were concealing. "Our guest hasn't arrived yet. He will. You made the terms clear information exchange for appearance. Whatever else he is, he seems to honor transactional agreements." Shaw's gaze swept the gathering predatory interest barely masked by social convention. "The question is whether he'll honor them quietly or turn this evening into a demonstration." Emma's response died as her telepathic senses caught a shift in the ambient emotional field. Not panic yet, but the precursor, a collective intake of breath as conversations faltered and attention pivoted toward the main entrance. Accelerator had arrived. He wore formal clothing, the way someone might wear a uniform assigned by bureaucracy, technically correct, completely indifferent to its social significance. The white suit matched Emma's gown through coincidence rather than coordination, creating visual symmetry that would fuel speculation across every media outlet covering the event. But it was his entrance that generated the real impact. No portal, no vehicle, no conventional approach. He simply appeared at the threshold reality, accommodating his presence the way it might accommodate a law of physics that had decided to attend a party. Emma felt the telepathic landscape fracture as every psychic within range tried to probe him simultaneously. Jean Grey's careful touch, Xavier's vast awareness, a dozen lesser telepaths whose names she didn't bother learning, all of them reaching out with various levels of subtlety. All of them encountering the same incompatibility she'd experienced on that rooftop. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma projected her voice across the gathering with telekinetically amplified precision. "Our guest of honor has arrived. Please welcome him, as befits the spirit of this evening, with open minds and measured expectations." The phrasing was deliberate, a warning wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. Open minds, but measured. Welcome, but careful. She moved to intercept Accelerator before any well-meaning diplomat could create an incident through ignorance. "You came," she said, her voice pitched for his ears only. "I wasn't entirely certain you would honor the agreement. Transaction terms were clear." Accelerator replied, his gaze sweeping the gala with clinical assessment. Information access for public appearance. Both parties receive agreed value. Why wouldn't I attend? Because walking into concentrated, enhanced individuals while being labeled as an Omega-level threat showed either remarkable confidence or fundamental misunderstanding of danger, Emma thought, but didn't say. Indeed. Let me introduce you to Emma Frost. The interruption came from Scott Summers, who'd materialized with a tactical precision that made him dangerous despite his public image as a Boy Scout in tactical gear. His visor reflected ambient light, making his expression unreadable. "We need to talk. Privately." "Scott, this is hardly the time." "It's exactly the time," Scott interrupted again, his tone carrying weight that made several nearby conversations pause. "We've detected energy signatures consistent with Orcus technology. Multiple installations within 5 miles, all powered up and targeting this location. Whatever you think you're controlling here, you're not." Emma's composure cracked microscopically. 5 miles. Well outside Krakoa's traditional defense perimeter, positioned for exactly the kind of plausible deniability Orcus specialized in. "You're certain? Beast confirmed it 10 minutes ago." "They're not hiding anymore. They want us to know they're watching." Scott's attention shifted to Accelerator, his body language suggesting he was addressing a landmine that might detonate if approached incorrectly. "You knew. When Emma invited you, you'd already calculated that Orcus would use this gathering as targeting opportunity. Probability was 87%. Accelerator confirmed. Concentration of enhanced individuals creates optimal demonstration scenario for Sentinel program justification. Standard tactical exploitation of predictable behavior. And you came anyway," Scott said, not quite a question. "Data density exceeds risk assessment, obviously." The exchange lasted seconds, but Emma felt its impact ripple through the telepathic field. Other conversations had stopped now, attention focusing on the confrontation with the weight of social gravity pulling everything toward its center. Jean Grey approached with deliberate calm, her presence radiating controlled power that reminded everyone why she was considered one of the most formidable telepaths alive. "Scott's right. We need to evacuate the civilian delegates immediately. If Orcus is preparing an assault..." The sky split open with light that burned retinas even through closed eyelids. Electromagnetic pulse cascaded across Krakoa's shores, frying unshielded electronics and dropping communication networks in microseconds. The crystalline structures that had been grown for the gala cracked as thermal stress exceeded their structural tolerances. Screams erupted as delegates who'd come seeking diplomatic triumph suddenly confronted the reality of being trapped in a combat zone. Through the chaos, Emma's telepathic senses caught the incoming threat before visual confirmation arrived. Sentinel units, dozens of them, descending from positions that shouldn't have been possible to hide. Not the standard models, these carried signatures suggesting Nimrod-level adaptive capability, manufactured in quantity that represented resource investment beyond anything Orcus had publicly acknowledged. Containment protocol initiated. A voice boomed across the gala, synthesized audio pitched to carry over panic. "All enhanced individuals are to remain stationary for processing. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. This is your only warning." The Sentinels established a perimeter with mechanical precision, cutting off escape routes while maintaining fields of fire that covered every square meter of the gathering. Emma ran tactical calculations. Instinctively, 200 guests, maybe 30, with combat-applicable powers trapped in a kill zone that had been designed specifically to neutralize their capabilities. Orcus hadn't come to capture. They'd come to demonstrate. Accelerator stood motionless at the center of the developing chaos, his expression unchanged as the world erupted into violence around him. Emma watched him process the situation. saw the slight tilt of his head that suggested he was measuring, calculating, deciding how this new data integrated with existing models. Emma, Shaw's voice cut through her analysis. We need to evacuate the civilians now. The Sentinels are focusing on enhanced individuals, but collateral damage in this environment. I know. Emma snapped her telepathic senses, already reaching out to coordinate with other psychics. A quick conference with Jean Xavier's vast awareness lending structure to their improvised network, Storm preparing to create atmospheric cover for evacuation. Then the first Sentinel opened fire. Plasma beams cut through the air where Cyclops had been standing a microsecond before his tactical instincts, saving him by margins too thin for comfort. His return fire, a measured optic blast, calibrated to disable rather than destroy, reflected off armored plating designed to absorb and disperse concussive force. More weapons activated. Energy beams, kinetic rounds, electromagnetic nets designed to incapacitate enhanced physiology. The Sentinels attacked with coordinated precision, each unit covering the other's approach vectors, creating overlapping fields of fire that made evasion increasingly difficult. The X-Men responded as they'd trained for decades, protecting civilians first, offensive actions secondary. Storm pulled delegates behind atmospheric barriers that turned plasma into dissipating heat. Nightcrawler teleported in rapid sequence, extracting non-combatants from the kill zone, in trips measured in heartbeats. Colossus positioned his armored body as mobile cover for clusters of terrified diplomats. But the Sentinels had learned from Nimrod's sacrifice. They adapted to each defensive measure within seconds of deployment, shifting tactics to exploit the X-Men's protective instincts. Every civilian they saved created new vulnerabilities. Every evacuation attempt drew fire that forced agonizing choices about who to protect. Emma felt the telepathic network strain under the coordination demands. Dozens of minds trying to work as one, while trauma and terror threatened to shred their connection. Jean anchored the network with vast experience. But even she couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. They were trying to save everyone, and the Sentinels only needed to kill anyone. Through it all, Accelerator remained untouched. The Sentinels' targeting systems identified him, calculated firing solutions, executed attack protocols with machine efficiency. Plasma, kinetic force, electromagnetic pulses, everything Nimrod had tested, and more besides. And everything reflected with the same mathematical precision attacks, redirected back toward their sources, with vectors inverted to maximize destructive potential. 3 Sentinels exploded in the first 30 seconds, their own weapons turning them into shrapnel that forced nearby units into defensive configurations. The remaining machines adjusted, but adjustment meant nothing against someone who could make physics itself negotiate. Emma watched him stand there, a void of calm amid manufactured apocalypse, and realized with dawning horror what Orcus had actually orchestrated. They weren't trying to capture him, they were creating footage. Every camera still functioning captured the scene, an individual labeled as a mutant, standing untouched, while destruction radiated outward, while heroes struggled to protect innocents from weapons that should never have breached Krakoa's defenses. The narrative wrote itself. Omega-level mutant remains unharmed while others suffer. Enhanced individual treats, civilian safety is irrelevant. Proof that technological containment is humanity's only defense. He needs to help. Someone shouted, a diplomatic delegate who'd found courage in terror. He's just standing there. Make him help. Accelerator's head turned fractionally, attention shifting to the speaker with the interest one might show an unexpected data point. Help with what your survival is a consequence of choices made by others. I'm not responsible for optimizing outcomes I didn't create. The words landed like physical blows, audible in a brief lull between sentinel salvos. Emma felt the psychic impact ripple through the crowd, shock, outrage, fear crystallizing into narrative that would echo far beyond this single night. Mutant refuses to save innocents. Enhanced individual displays inhuman disregard. Omega-level threat confirms they cannot coexist with normal humanity. You callous bastard. Magneto's voice cut across the chaos, the master of magnetism descending from where he'd been redirecting sentinel attacks away from civilian clusters. These people came here in good faith, seeking peace, and you treat their deaths as irrelevant variables. They're not my variables. Accelerator replied, his tone suggesting he was clarifying a simple misunderstanding. Your gala, your security failures, your consequence management. I'm here for information exchange, not crisis intervention in conflicts I didn't initiate. Magneto's fury manifested as visible distortion in the magnetic field around them. Metal fragments rising from destroyed sentinels and orbiting like angry planets. Then leave. Take your mathematical certainty and your inhuman logic, and the sky tore open again, but this time the light came from beneath. Orcus's Omega threshold activated with power that made the initial EMP feel like a flashlight by comparison. Energy erupted from hidden installations, converging on predetermined coordinates that Emma's tactical analysis recognized with sick certainty the exact position where enhanced individuals clustered most densely, where they'd gathered trying to protect civilians. The threshold field generated a specific kind of pressure, not physical force, but something that acted directly on enhanced physiology. Emma felt it through her telepathic senses, a compression of the energies that defined mutation. A forcing function designed to make Omega-level signatures collide and cascade. Jean Grey gasped, her phoenix-touched consciousness recoiling from contact with the field. Storm's weather manipulation flickered as atmospheric control became suddenly inexplicably difficult. Even Magneto's ironclad grip on magnetic fields showed strain metal fragments falling as concentration wavered. Omega threshold at full power. Dr. Killian's voice transmitted across all frequencies, ensuring maximum media coverage. Containing enhanced individual threats. All non-combatants maintain safe distance. This technology represents humanity's answer to existential risk. Emma tried to maintain the telepathic network, but the threshold's pressure made coherent thought feel like swimming through concrete. She felt Jean's presence fragmenting Xavier's vast awareness, compressing into smaller and smaller spaces, other psychics simply dropping from the network as the strain exceeded their capacity. And through it all, she watched Accelerator. The threshold field touched him, wrapped around him, tried to force the same compression it was applying to every other enhanced individual. She felt it through her psychic senses, vast energies converging, attempting to create the collision Orcus had calculated would push him past stable limits. Accelerator's expression shifted microscopically. Not pain, not fear. Clinical interest, the look of someone observing experimental results. Then the vectors inverted. The threshold field didn't just fail, it reversed. Energy that Orcus had pumped into forcing compression suddenly found its directional components rewritten pressure, becoming suction convergence, becoming violent dispersal. The feedback cascaded through every installation, simultaneously electromagnetic forces that should have been tightly controlled spiraling into chaos. Emma felt the psychic pressure vanish as the threshold collapsed, replaced by a different kind of strain reality itself, protesting the contradiction between what Orcus's device demanded and what Accelerator's vector manipulation enforced. Around them, the environment began to behave incorrectly. Gravity didn't fail so much as become confused about which direction to pull. Heat dispersed in patterns that violated thermodynamic expectations. Light bent through angles that shouldn't exist in normal space, creating visual artifacts that made Emma's eyes hurt when she tried to focus on them. The Sentinel's targeting systems failed. Their threat assessment algorithms unable to process an environment where fundamental constants had become variables. Several units simply froze, caught in logic loops, trying to reconcile sensor input that contradicted every baseline assumption about how reality operated. Threshold failure. An analyst's voice cut through Killian's channel panic, bleeding through professional composure. The device it's not failing, it's being used against us. Energy output is inverse to input parameters. We're creating a localized reality distortion field, and he's... Static consumed the transmission as another Orcus installation overloaded its containment, failing under stresses it had never been designed to handle. Jean Grey pulled herself upright, her telepathic presence battered but functional. Emma felt her reach out across the psychic plane not to attack, but to understand. What she found made her recoil. He's vectorizing the threshold output. Jean's voice carried telepathically to every psychic still conscious. Not just reflecting it, he's processing the energy meant to force Omega collision and converting it into localized physics manipulation. The field isn't compressing him. It's fueling him. That's not possible. Emma transmitted back, watching the environment continue its subtle wrongness. The threshold generates multi-spectrum energy designed to act on enhanced physiology directly. You can't vector manipulate something that's already tailored to... He's not manipulating the energy directly, Jean interrupted. He's manipulating the vectors the energy travels along. The threshold has to propagate through space to reach him. Space has directional components. Anything with direction can be inverted. Emma understood then, with the kind of sick clarity that accompanied watching a perfect trap spring in the wrong direction. Orcus had built a device to force evolution by creating collision between Omega-level energies. What they'd actually built was a power source for someone who could redirect any vector, including the vectors that carried their weapon's force. They'd armed him. Scott Summers' voice cut through the chaos with tactical authority forged through decades of impossible decisions. All X-Men priority shift. Forget the Sentinels, evacuate civilians now. Use the environmental distortions as cover. Nightcrawler maximum jump frequency. Storm atmospheric concealment. Colossus mobile barriers. Move. The X-Men responded with practiced coordination, exploiting the confusion as Sentinels struggled to adapt to an environment that no longer obeyed reliable physics. Delegates who'd come seeking diplomatic triumph found themselves hauled through reality-distorted space by heroes they'd spent the evening either courting or condemning. Emma contributed what she could: telepathic coordination, helping move people towards safety, even as she watched the gala, the Hellfire Club's statement of power, collapse into ruin that would define mutant-human relations for years. Magneto hung in the air above the devastation, magnetic field straining to maintain flight in gravity that couldn't decide on a consistent pull. His attention fixed on Accelerator with an expression that combined fury and something approaching vindication. "You see," Magneto's voice carried across the battlefield, addressing everyone and no one. "This is what I warned about. This is what happens when we assume good faith, when we invite the unknown into our sanctuaries. He's not here to coexist. He's here to demonstrate that we're obsolete." "Incorrect assessment." Accelerator replied, his voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of someone unaffected by the destruction surrounding them. "I'm demonstrating that your frameworks are insufficient. Your gala, your political theater, your assumption that public display creates legitimacy, all of it based on the belief that others will respect boundaries you've established. Orcus proved that belief was incorrect. I'm just processing the resulting data. By letting innocents suffer, Magneto's anger manifested as metal rising from the wreckage, shaped into accusing spears that surrounded Accelerator without quite attacking. You could have stopped this. Could have prevented the threshold activation, disabled the Sentinels, protected the civilians. But you stood there running calculations while people died. People died because Orcus attacked. Accelerator corrected. Because your security failed. Because you gathered targets in a predictable location and expected enemies to respect diplomatic immunity. I didn't create those conditions. I'm simply not expending resources to mitigate consequences of others' failed planning." The argument would have continued. Emma sensed, except reality itself was beginning to protest the sustained distortion. The threshold's reversed output was creating localized physics that couldn't maintain stability indefinitely. Already she could feel space starting to fracture tiny rifts, opening between what was and what mathematically shouldn't be possible. One of those rifts tore wider, creating a visible distortion that swallowed 3 Sentinel units and half a crystalline structure before collapsing back to nothing. Where it had opened, the ground showed signs of having existed in a different state. Grass that had been green was now somehow simultaneously alive, and not matter caught between quantum states that macro-scale objects had no business occupying. The dimensional barriers are destabilizing. Beast's voice transmitted across all channels, his analysis punctuated by sounds of frantic calculation. The threshold's energy is being redirected into reality itself. If this continues, we're looking at cascading dimensional tears that could... Another rift opened, this one large enough to see through. Emma caught a glimpse of somewhere else, a cityscape that shared no architectural lineage with anything on Earth's skyscrapers built according to physics that made her eyes hurt to perceive. The rift to Accelerator's original world, she realized. The same multiversal fracture that had brought him here reopening under stress from redirected threshold energy. Accelerator noticed it too. His attention shifted from the argument with Magneto to the rift head tilting in that characteristic assessment gesture. He stood there for 3 seconds that felt like hours, apparently weighing options against priorities only he understood. Then he walked toward the rift. "Wait," Emma transmitted telepathically, pushing through the cognitive strain the environmental distortions created. "If you leave now, Orcus wins the narrative. The footage shows you standing idle while civilians suffered, then fleeing when confronted. That's the story that spreads Omega-level mutant, proves too dangerous for coexistence, then abandons the consequences of their presence." Accelerator paused. "Your narrative concerns are not my optimization criteria. But data quality is..." Emma pressed, playing the only card that might matter. "You came here for information about this world's power structures. Leave now, and you've only learned half the equation, how they attack. Stay long enough to observe the aftermath, and you'll learn how they reconstruct, how they assign blame, how political systems process catastrophic failure. That's data you can't get from passive observation." She felt him calculate, weighing the value of additional information against whatever parameters governed his decision-making. The rift pulsed behind him, growing more stable as the threshold's reversed energy found it as an outlet for forces that needed somewhere to go. "Irrelevant," Accelerator said finally. "I've gathered sufficient data about this world's operational frameworks. Continuing observation shows diminishing returns. The rift provides optimal exit vector with minimal additional resource expenditure. So you're just leaving?" Jean Grey said, her voice carrying the weight of someone watching hope collapse. "Leaving us to deal with the political fallout, the casualties, the proof that Orcus was right to fear enhanced individuals operating without oversight." "Your framing is incorrect," Accelerator replied. "Orcus wasn't right. They made tactical error by assuming their threshold could force evolution in a system they didn't understand. But yes, I'm leaving. This environment no longer provides useful data, and the rift offers return transit, with probability approaching certainty." He turned fully toward the dimensional tear, apparently satisfied that further conversation held no value. Emma felt the moment crystallizing, the point where narrative would solidify into history that determined decades of future policy. "Then go!" Magneto's voice cut across the distance, magnetic fields collapsing as he descended to ground level among the wounded and terrified. "Go back to whatever mathematics-obsessed reality spawned you. Leave us to clean up the wreckage of your experiment. At least when you're gone, we'll only have to fight human hatred instead of inhuman indifference." Accelerator didn't respond. He simply walked through the rift, his form transitioning from solid to translucent to absent as he crossed dimensional boundaries that shouldn't have been traversable without specialized equipment. The rift collapsed 3 seconds after he passed through reality, reasserting itself with a sound like tearing fabric and relief. The environmental distortions began stabilizing immediately, gravity remembering which direction to pull. Heat dispersing according to recognizable thermodynamic principles. Emma stood in the ruins of the gala, telepathically sensing the emotional landscape of 200 traumatized delegates, 30 wounded heroes, and uncountable millions watching through cameras that had captured every second of the catastrophe. The Hellfire Club's statement of power had become proof of vulnerability. The X-Men's protective instincts had been weaponized against them. And Orcus, despite their threshold failing, despite the Sentinels' destruction, had achieved exactly what they'd calculated. They had footage of an Omega-level individual standing untouched while others suffered. They had proof that enhanced individuals created collateral damage that conventional security couldn't contain. They had a narrative that would justify every Sentinel program, every restrictive policy, every argument that mutants represented existential risk. Emma, Scott's voice pulled her from spiral of strategic catastrophe assessment. We need to coordinate trauma response. Get civilians to medical facilities, contain the media narrative as much as possible, prepare statements explaining what happened. What happened? Emma repeated, her voice empty of the frost that usually defined her. Is that we got played, all of us. Orcus set the trap, we walked into it, and he provided the demonstration they needed while remaining technically blameless. Every faction behaved exactly as predicted. Then, we changed the prediction, Jean said, moving to stand beside Scott, with the kind of unity that had sustained them through decades of crises. We document Orcus's attacks, show they initiated violence, prove they built the threshold without oversight or legal authorization. We turn their narrative against them. Emma wanted to believe that would work. Wanted to share their optimism that truth could overcome optics, that careful documentation would outweigh visceral footage of a being who'd let innocents suffer rather than compromise mathematical purity. But she'd seen the cameras, seen the expressions on diplomatic faces as they realized their trust had been betrayed not just by Orcus, but by mutants who'd promised safety and delivered catastrophe instead. The Hellfire Gala was over. The real consequences were just beginning. And somewhere in another dimension, a consciousness built on vector mathematics was processing the evening's data, incorporating new information about how societies handled failure, refining predictions about human behavior under stress. He'd gotten exactly what he came for. The fact that it cost others everything was simply another data point in an equation that never stopped solving itself. Mathematics, after all, had no opinion about the value of what it calculated, only the accuracy of its conclusions. The war room in Westchester had never felt smaller. Holographic displays covered every surface, streaming data that painted a picture of controlled catastrophe. Casualty count 17 dead, 53 injured, hundreds traumatized beyond immediate psychological recovery. Media coverage, every major network running the same footage on loop, the same narrative, crystallizing into political cement. Public opinion polling, plummeting numbers that suggested decades of careful bridge building had collapsed in a single evening. Scott Summers stood at the center of it all, his visor reflecting data streams until his face became a mosaic of bad news. Around him, the X-Men processed aftermath in their own ways. Logan paced like a caged predator, healing factor managing physical damage, while rage found no productive outlet. Storm stood with arms crossed, her usual serenity fractured by guilt over atmospheric defenses that had proven insufficient. Beast worked multiple terminals simultaneously, compiling evidence that felt increasingly like arranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. The footage is everywhere, Kitty Pryde reported from her station, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 6 hours coordinating crisis response. Not just the attacks, they're showing him standing there. Standing there while people screamed for help. I've counted 47 different cuts, each one edited to maximize the impact of his refusal to intervene. Orcus is flooding social media with manufactured accounts. Beast added without looking up from his analysis, amplifying the narrative that Omega-level mutants represent uncontrollable risk. They're citing him as proof that enhanced individuals cannot be trusted with public safety, regardless of their stated intentions. "He's not a mutant," Jean said quietly, from where she sat, eyes closed and telepathic senses extending across the wounded, still recovering in the medical bay. "We have proof now. The genetic data, the multiversal contamination, Cerebro's false positive. We can prove Orcus lied about his classification." "To whom?" Logan's question cut through the technical analysis with brutal simplicity. "The public that just watched him let 17 people die. The government's already drafting enhanced individual registration acts. Everyone who matters has already decided what the truth is, and our proof looks like desperate damage control." The silence that followed carried weight. They'd spent decades fighting for coexistence, building trust one rescued civilian at a time, demonstrating that mutants could be heroes despite the fear their existence generated. One evening had undone years of careful work, and the architect of that undoing had simply left through a dimensional tear, without apparent concern for the wreckage. Charles Xavier's voice broke the tension transmitted from Cerebro, where he'd been coordinating with injured telepaths. "Scott, I need you in Cerebro. We have a situation." The phrasing sent tactical alarms through Scott's awareness. Xavier didn't say, "We have a problem." Problems were expected manageable. Situations meant something had evolved beyond standard crisis protocols. He found Xavier in Cerebro's chamber, the amplification helmet still connected despite the strain visible in the professor's posture. Around him, holographic projections showed psychic landscapes that Scott's non-telepathic awareness couldn't fully parse, but the patterns suggested disturbance on a massive scale. "The dimensional rift didn't fully close," Xavier said without preamble. "When he left, the threshold's inverted energy created fractures in the barriers between realities. Most sealed, but not all. I can feel them small tears where our world bleeds into others, where the fundamental constants we rely on become negotiable." Scott processed this with the tactical mind that had kept the X-Men functional through apocalypses. How widespread? Localized to a 5-mile radius around the Galaxite currently, but expanding. Slowly, but measurably. If left unchecked, we're looking at dimensional instability that could cascade into something far worse than property damage. Xavier removed the helmet, wincing as the amplified psychic input ceased. "There's more." I touched one of the tears, tried to understand its nature. "Scott, I felt him. Not physically present, but the signature of his vector manipulation is embedded in the fractures themselves. He didn't just leave, he fundamentally altered how reality behaves in those spaces. Can we seal the tears?" "That's not the right question," Jean said, entering the chamber with Storm and Beast close behind. "I've been coordinating with Emma Frost. Yes, I know the optics are terrible, but she has resources we need. The tears aren't wounds that can be stitched. They're spaces where his mathematical framework superseded our physical laws. Sealing them would require either recreating his vector manipulation or finding a way to convince reality to forget it ever learned different mathematics." Beast pulled up a new holographic display showing energy signatures that fluctuated according to patterns. Scott didn't have the physics background to interpret. The good news, relatively speaking, is that the tears are stable at their current size. They're not spreading rapidly, just existing as pockets of altered physics. The bad news is threefold: first, anything entering those spaces operates under his rules rather than ours. Second, they're creating observable phenomena that will attract attention we cannot afford. Third, Orcus knows about them. "How do you know that?" Storm asked. "Because they're already setting up monitoring stations," Kitty said, her voice transmitted through the room's communication system. "I just got reports from our reconnaissance team. Orcus has deployed containment equipment around 3 of the major tears. They're not trying to seal them, they're studying them. Scott felt the tactical situation crystallize with sick clarity. Orcus had footage of catastrophe. They had public opinion shifting toward registration and containment. And now they had physical evidence of dimensional instability caused by an individual they'd successfully labeled as a mutant. Never mind that the label was factually incorrect. They're building a case. Scott said the words, tasting like defeat. Omega-level mutants create dimensional tiers. Enhanced individuals destabilize reality itself. Every tier becomes proof that we're existential threats, requiring immediate technological intervention, while conveniently ignoring that their threshold device created the conditions for those tiers in the first place. Logan growled. Typical human playbook: create the disaster, blame the mutant, sell the solution. The playbook works because we keep responding predictably. Jean said, her telepathic awareness carrying weight beyond her words. They attack, we defend. They create crisis, we manage consequences. They control narrative, we provide evidence nobody wants to hear. We're always reactive, always a step behind, always fighting on terrain they've chosen. Then we change the terrain. Scott said, decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from accepting impossible situations. We stopped trying to beat him. We never could. The power differential is too extreme. We stopped trying to defend our reputation. The footage has already decided public opinion. Instead, we do what X-Men do best. We solve the problem nobody else can solve, and we make sure everyone knows we did it. Storm's expression shifted to something approaching hope. The dimensional tiers. Exactly. Scott confirmed his tactical mind, already assembling operation parameters. Orcus wants to study them, use them as evidence. We're going to seal them. Every single tier methodically and publicly. We document everything, show the world that enhanced individuals don't just create problems. We solve them even when cleaning up after our own kind costs us everything. Our own kind. Beast repeated his tone, suggesting he'd caught the phrasing. You're maintaining the false narrative that he's a mutant. Tactically, yes. Scott said, the admission bitter but necessary. Trying to convince the public he's not one of us right now looks like deflecting responsibility. Instead, we own it. We take responsibility for an Omega-level mutant's actions because that's what heroes do. We clean up messes regardless of who made them. Let Orcus play politics. We'll do the work that actually matters. Xavier studied his former student with an expression that combined pride and concern. That's a dangerous precedent, Scott. Taking responsibility for actions we didn't commit, for an individual we can't control, sets expectations we may not be able to meet in future crises. Professor, with respect, we're past worrying about future precedents, Scott replied. Right now, mutant-human relations are hanging by a thread. We need a win, something concrete that shows we're part of the solution. The tiers are that opportunity. There's a tactical problem, Beast interjected, pulling up schematics that showed the tiers' distribution. Based on my analysis, sealing these spaces will require either matching his vector manipulation, which we cannot do, or overwhelming the altered physics with sufficient contrary force to reset local reality to baseline parameters. The energy requirements alone would require coordinated Omega-level output, Jean finished. Multiple powerful mutants working in concert, using our abilities not to attack, but to reinforce conventional physics. Storm controlling atmospheric pressure to standard parameters, myself and Emma providing psychic scaffolding to stabilize quantum uncertainty. Magneto anchoring electromagnetic constants. That's still guesswork, Logan pointed out. We're talking about rewriting reality back to normal when we don't even understand how he rewrote it in the first place. Then we test on the smallest tiers first, Scott said, command decisions flowing with the momentum of committed action. We develop protocols, refine techniques, document everything, so the world sees us working to fix damage rather than creating it. Best case, we succeed and prove enhanced individuals are essential for managing enhanced threats. Worst case, we fail publicly while trying to help, which is still better optics than the current narrative. Storm moved to the tactical display, her fingers tracing patterns through the holographic representation of tier locations. The atmospheric distortions I can manage. I've been maintaining planetary weather patterns for decades. Local reality manipulation is just extreme meteorology. But the quantum instabilities John mentioned will require precision. I'm not certain we can coordinate under field conditions. That's where Emma comes in. Jean said, her voice carrying reluctance born from years of complicated history with the White Queen. I hate admitting this, but she has the telepathic precision for coordinating multiple Omega-level mutants simultaneously. Her diamond form also provides physical resilience if the tiers destabilize during intervention attempts. You're proposing we work with the Hellfire Club, Xavier said carefully. The same organization that invited him to the gala, that treated a dimensional anomaly as a political asset rather than a threat. I'm proposing we work with Emma Frost, Jean corrected. She made mistakes, but she's also been coordinating trauma response for the last 6 hours without sleep. Whatever her motivations, she wants to fix this as much as we do. And we need her capabilities. Scott made the call that leadership demanded. Contact her. Set up a meeting for tactical coordination, neutral ground, full transparency about what we're attempting. Beast. I need detailed analysis of each tier size, stability, energy signature, everything that might inform approach strategy. Storm, start running atmospheric models for reality stabilization. Logan, Kitty, Nightcrawler, I need you coordinating perimeter security. If Orcus interferes with tier stabilization, we need to be able to protect the operation without creating more bad optics. The assignments created momentum, transformed despair into directed effort. The X-Men dispersed to their tasks with the practiced efficiency of a team that had faced extinction events and found ways to survive through pure, stubborn competence. Scott remained in Cerebro, staring at the holographic representation of dimensional tiers scattered across what had been peaceful countryside. Each one represented a space where mathematics had overwritten physics, where the rules governing reality had been negotiated by an entity that viewed such negotiations as simple optimization problems. You're taking on responsibility for something we didn't cause, Xavier said quietly, wheeling closer. Accepting blame for actions beyond our control. That's a heavy burden, Scott. All leadership is heavy, Scott replied, his visor hiding eyes that carried decades of impossible decisions. But you taught me that being X-Men means more than just fighting for mutant survival. It means being better than we have to be doing the work nobody else can do, protecting people even when they hate us for it. If that means taking responsibility for damage an interdimensional anomaly caused, so be it. At least we're doing something productive instead of just watching the world decide we're monsters. Xavier's telepathic presence brushed Scott's mind with gentle approval. You've grown into everything I hoped you'd become. I just wish the circumstances didn't require quite so much growing. Yeah, Scott said, the word carrying weight of exhaustion he couldn't afford to show the others. Me too. The meeting with Emma Frost took place 6 hours later in neutral territory. An abandoned warehouse, Beast had swept for surveillance devices 3 times before declaring it acceptably secure. Emma arrived with Sebastian Shaw, both dressed for business. Rather than diplomacy, their body language suggesting this wasn't a social call. Scott Summers? Emma greeted him with none of her usual Frost exhaustion, bleeding through her diamond-hard composure. You have a proposal for fixing the dimensional tears. Let's hear it before I collapse from sustained telepathic trauma management. Scott outlined the plan with tactical efficiency coordinated Omega-level intervention to stabilize each tear sequentially documented publicly to demonstrate enhanced individuals solving problems. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone evaluating resource allocation against strategic return. "It could work," she said when he finished. "The coordination requirements are extreme but manageable with proper psychic scaffolding. The optics are sound. Nothing counters. Mutants are dangerous, quite like mutants prevent dimensional collapse. The political capital alone would justify the resource investment." "This isn't about politics," Jean said, her voice sharp with the kind of idealism Emma usually mocked. "This is about fixing damage, preventing casualties, doing what's right, regardless of strategic benefit. And that's why you'll always be reactive," Emma replied, not unkindly. "You do what's right and hope the optics follow. I do what's strategically optimal and let morality be a happy side effect. Neither approach is wrong, Jean. They're just optimized for different outcomes. Can we table the philosophical debate until after we've prevented reality from destabilizing?" Scott interrupted his leadership, cutting through ideological friction with practiced efficiency. "Emma, are you in or not?" "I'm in," Emma confirmed. "On one condition, this operation is documented and released under joint X-Men and Hellfire Club authorization. We share the political capital equally, which means we share the blame equally if it fails. I won't have my organization taking secondary credit for primary effort." Scott wanted to refuse. On principle, the X-Men didn't operate for credit, didn't measure success in political capital. But tactical reality demanded compromise, and Emma's participation was essential for success, probability that wasn't purely aspirational. "Agreed," he said. "Joint operation, joint documentation, joint outcomes. We brief the team in 1 hour, field deployment in 12. First target is the smallest tear. If our approach works, we scale up. If it fails, we adjust methodology and try again until we find something that does work." "Acceptable terms," Emma said, extending her hand. Scott shook it, the gesture feeling like signing a contract with clauses he'd regret later. But that was leadership making deals you hated because the alternatives were worse. The first field deployment assembled at 0600 hours sunrise, painting the dimensional tear in colors that physics insisted shouldn't exist simultaneously. The tear measured approximately 3 meters in diameter, a spherical distortion hovering 2 feet above ground level that made the space inside it behave according to rules that contradicted surrounding reality. Beast had set up monitoring equipment in a perimeter around the tear sensors, measuring everything from quantum fluctuation to gravitational constant deviation. Media crews filmed from safe distance. Scott had contacted them personally, explaining the operation and inviting documentation with the understanding that this was enhanced individuals preventing catastrophe rather than causing it. The core team consisted of 5 mutants whose combined power represented enough force to reshape continents if applied destructively. Storm controlling atmospheric pressure, magneto anchoring electromagnetic constants, Jean and Emma providing telepathic scaffolding to stabilize quantum uncertainty, and Iceman managing thermal dynamics at the molecular level. Remember, Scott transmitted through their communication network, "We're not attacking the tear. We're convincing reality that it never existed." Gentle, sustained pressure across all fundamental constants simultaneously. Beast will monitor stability. If we're making things worse, he'll call abort, and we withdraw immediately. "Encouraging pep talk," Logan muttered from perimeter security position, "real confidence-inspiring." "Quiet," Scott replied. "Team on my mark, 3, 2, 1, engage." Storm extended her awareness into the tear's atmospheric profile, feeling wind patterns that curved through angles geometry insisted were impossible. She didn't try to force correction. Instead, she offered the air alternative patterns, suggestions of how pressure gradients might prefer to behave if given the choice. Gentle persistence, like teaching dance to a partner who'd only ever known one song. Magneto felt the electromagnetic fields within the tear, their polarity flickering between states that shouldn't coexist. He anchored them with the certainty that came from decades of absolute control, providing stable reference points the fields could align to. not domination stabilization. Jean and Emma merged their telepathic capabilities, creating a scaffolding of consciousness that touched the quantum uncertainty underlying the tear. Where observation traditionally collapsed wave functions into definite states, they offered probability itself reasons to prefer conventional behavior. It was delicate work requiring precision that made surgical telepathy look crude by comparison. Iceman worked at the molecular level, managing heat transfer across the boundary where the tear met normal space. The temperature differentials were extreme matter. Inside the tear existed at multiple thermal states simultaneously. A violation of thermodynamics so fundamental that Bobby Drake's mind hurt trying to perceive it accurately. He cooled what needed cooling, warmed. What needed warming created equilibrium that thermodynamics could recognize and accept. For 17 minutes, nothing visible happened. The tear remained stable, monitoring equipment showing fluctuations that Beast interpreted with real-time analysis transmitted directly to Scott's awareness. Then reality remembered how it was supposed to work. The change wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no flash of light, no cinematic collapse. The tear simply became less certain of its own existence, its boundaries growing transparent as conventional physics reasserted authority over the space it had briefly lost. Fundamental constant stabilized quantum uncertainty collapsed into definite states, electromagnetic fields aligned to expected polarity. The tear sealed with a sound like released breath, leaving behind nothing but air that had briefly forgotten which direction to flow. Successful stabilization, Beast reported, his voice carrying excitement that made him sound decades younger. All measurements returning to baseline parameters. The space where the tear existed now shows no deviation from conventional physics. Team, you did it. The media crews captured everything enhanced individuals, working in concert, applying vast power with surgical precision, solving a problem that conventional science had no framework to address. Not destroying, not fighting, healing reality itself through coordinated effort. Scott allowed himself 3 seconds of satisfaction before moving to operational next steps. Team, excellent work. Maintain positions while Beast confirms stability. Then we move to Tear 2. Emma Jean, how are you holding up on the telepathic coordination? Manageable? Emma replied, her mental voice carrying strains she'd never admit verbally. The quantum scaffolding is more demanding than anticipated, but sustainable for approximately 4 more interventions before I'll need rest. 5 tiers per deployment cycle then, Scott calculated. We'll work in shifts, document everything, maintain public transparency about progress. This becomes our narrative, not the Gala disaster, but the solution. Enhanced individuals as essential rather than existential. Over the next 72 hours, the operation unfolded with grinding persistence. Each tier required hours of concentrated effort, teams rotating through shifts to prevent exhaustion-driven mistakes. Media coverage shifted incrementally, initial skepticism, giving way to cautious acknowledgement as tear after tear sealed without incident. Public opinion polls began to stabilize, then shift. Not dramatically, but measurably. The footage of coordinated Omega-level intervention provided counter-narrative to the Gala disaster. Proof that enhanced individuals could solve problems they hadn't created. That power applied precisely was protection rather than threat. Orcus protested, of course. Claimed the X-Men were interfering with legitimate research, argued that studying the tiers would provide better long-term solutions than sealing them. But their protests lost traction against documented evidence of dimensional instability, being methodically eliminated by the very individuals Orcus had claimed were uncontrollable. By the end of the 3rd day, 15 tiers had been sealed. Beast projected another week to complete the operation, assuming no complications and sustainable team rotation. Scott coordinated from the war room, managing logistics while monitoring for Orcus interference that he knew was coming. but couldn't predict in what form. It came during the sealing of Terra 17. The operation proceeded normally. For the first 13 minutes, storm stabilizing atmosphere, magneto-anchoring fields, telepaths managing quantum uncertainty. Then Beast's sensors detected anomalous energy signatures approaching from multiple vectors. Abort. Beast's voice cut across all channels. Unknown energy sources converging on your position. Patterns consistent with. Sentinel units descended from positions that should have been outside their operational range weapon systems, charging with power signatures that made Beast's monitors scream warnings. But these weren't standard units. The design bore similarities to Nimrod's adaptive architecture, suggesting Orcus had manufactured more learning platforms from the data their sacrifice had provided. Maintain the seal. Scott ordered, tactical decision made in microseconds. Logan intercept. Kitty Nightcrawler harassment patterns to disrupt their targeting. Storm. I know you're committed to the tear, but give me 30 seconds of atmospheric interference when I call it. The Sentinels opened fire with the coordinated precision that represented their primary advantage over organic opponents. But they were firing at targets who'd spent 3 days learning to work as synchronized unit, whose coordination had been refined through repeated operations under Emma Frost's telepathic scaffolding. Logan's claws found weak points in armor that had been designed to resist kinetic force, not molecular-level adamantium penetration. Kitty phased through targeting solutions that assumed solid opponents pulling sensor arrays offline with precise sabotage. Nightcrawler's teleportation created randomized positioning that adaptive algorithms struggled to predict faster than he could relocate. Energy signature change, Beast reported. The Sentinels are charging weapons beyond standard parameters. Scott, they're preparing to... The Sentinels fired not at the X-Men, but at the tear itself. The dimensional instability, already stressed by sealing operation, couldn't withstand directed energy impact. It destabilized, catastrophically expanding in microseconds, from 3 meters to 30, the boundary between conventional physics and mathematical override becoming contested territory, where neither framework could maintain authority. Team withdraw, Scott ordered. Beast, what are we looking at? Cascading instability. Beast replied, his voice tight with the kind of fear that came from understanding exactly how bad the situation was. The tear is trying to collapse and expand simultaneously. If it reaches critical threshold, we're looking at dimensional overlap that could affect the entire region. Emma Frost's telepathic presence cut through the tactical chatter with diamond-sharp focus. Scott, I can stabilize it. But I'll need every telepath you have linked through me, and I'll need Jean to anchor my consciousness while I'm doing it. The strain will be extreme, Jean finished. Do it, I've got you. What followed lasted 93 seconds and aged everyone involved by years. Emma extended her consciousness into the destabilizing tear, using every telepath within range as amplification network. She touched the quantum uncertainty that was trying to resolve in contradictory directions simultaneously. And instead of fighting it, she offered it a choice: collapse cleanly or expand catastrophically. The tear chose collapse because Emma Frost's telepathic will made that choice the path of least resistance. The dimensional instability, sealed with force that created a pressure wave, felt 3 miles away, reality snapping back to conventional parameters, with the relief of elastic, finally released from impossible tension. Emma collapsed immediately, diamond form shattering into unconsciousness as the strain exceeded even her formidable limits. Jean caught her telepathically before the trauma could cause permanent damage, cradling Emma's consciousness with gentle precision until medical teams could reach them. The Sentinels withdrew as suddenly as they'd appeared, their mission apparently complete. Despite the tear's successful stabilization, Scott watched them go with cold certainty about what had just occurred. Orcus hadn't tried to stop the operation. They'd tried to sabotage it in a way that would create public disaster proof that enhanced individuals couldn't be trusted with dimensional crisis management. The fact that the X-Men had succeeded despite sabotage would be buried under footage of Sentinels forced to intervene when mutant operations destabilized. Except the media crews had captured everything. The attack, the destabilization, the heroic telepathic intervention that prevented catastrophe. And Beast's monitoring equipment had recorded energy signatures, proving the Sentinels had fired first deliberately targeting the Terror rather than the X-Men. "Get that data to every media outlet immediately," Scott ordered. "Full technical analysis timestamps everything that proves Orcus sabotaged a successful operation. I want this narrative shift before they can spin it." Beast was already moving his fingers, flying across portable terminals. "Transmitting now." And Scott, Emma Frost just saved approximately 50,000 lives. Whatever our philosophical differences, she deserves acknowledgement for that. "Agreed," Scott said, watching medical teams stabilize Emma's unconscious form. "When she wakes up, we make sure she knows. For now, we finish the job." "How many tiers remain?" "8 ties," Beast replied. "All smaller than 17. Projected completion in 48 hours if we maintain current operational tempo." "Then that's what we do," Scott said, his voice carrying exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "We finish sealing every tear, we document everything, and we prove that enhanced individuals are the solution, not the problem. No matter what Orcus throws at us." The operation continued for another 2 days. Each tier sealed with increasing efficiency as the teams refined their coordination. Emma recovered after 18 hours, returned to the field, despite medical protests, and provided the telepathic scaffolding that made success possible. By the time the last tier sealed, public opinion had shifted measurably. Not completely. Decades of anti-mutant sentiment couldn't be erased by one successful operation, but enough to matter. Enough to prove that heroism wasn't defined by species, that power applied precisely could protect rather than threaten. The X-Men gathered in Westchester's war room one final time, reviewing operation outcomes with the kind of tired satisfaction that came from winning battles that should have been unwinnable. "Final accounting," Beast reported. 23-dimensional tiers sealed 0 casualties during operations and public approval of enhanced individual crisis response, up 17% across all demographics. Orcus's sabotage attempt backfired spectacularly. Their Sentinel attack is now cited as proof that technological containment creates more problems than it solves. "Don't celebrate yet," Logan cautioned. "Orcus still has the gala footage. Still has their narrative about Omega-level threats. We won this round, but the war's far from over." "Wars are never won in single battles," Scott agreed. "But battles matter. We proved we're part of the solution. That's a win worth taking, even if it's not total victory." Jean smiled with the kind of warmth that reminded everyone why she was the heart of the team. "We did something important here, something that matters beyond politics and public opinion. We fixed damage, prevented catastrophe, and we did it together. That's what X-Men means." Storm raised a glass in quiet toast. "To doing the work nobody else can do, to being better than we have to be, to proving that the equation isn't just about power, it's about what we choose to do with it." They drank to that exhausted heroes, taking brief satisfaction in hard-won success before the next crisis demanded their attention. In his office, Charles Xavier reviewed the operation logs with pride that came from watching students exceed their teachers' expectations. They'd faced an impossible situation and found a way through determination and coordinated effort. Not perfect victory, the dimensional tiers should never have existed, but victory nonetheless. His telepathic senses brushed the space where the tiers had been feeling reality's scar tissue, where mathematics had briefly overwritten physics. The tiers were sealed, but the memory remained. Reality itself had been changed by contact with an entity that viewed physical law as negotiable framework. And somewhere in another dimension, that entity was processing the same data, incorporating lessons about how this world's heroes responded to crisis, refining predictions about human behavior under extreme pressure. He'd gotten what he came for. The X-Men had gotten their victory. The equation balanced for now, but mathematics never stopped solving itself. And the next iteration would incorporate everything both sides had learned from this engagement. Xavier closed his eyes and hoped that when the next calculation completed, there would still be room in the solution for concepts like heroism and hope. 3 weeks after the gala, the world was still processing what had happened. Congressional hearings had been convened, their proceedings broadcast across every major network. Orcus executives sat in uncomfortable chairs, while politicians demanded accountability for the threshold device that had never received authorization for the Sentinel deployment, that had violated international law for the sabotage of mutant-led crisis response operations. Dr. Killian testified under oath, his composure unshaken despite the evidence mounted against him. When asked about the threshold's true purpose, he'd replied with clinical precision that turned congressional outrage into uncomfortable silence. The device was designed to test limits, to determine whether Omega-level enhanced individuals could be pushed past stability thresholds through controlled energy convergence. The hypothesis was sound-applied stress, reveals operational parameters that passive observation cannot detect. The fact that the subject inverted our methodology doesn't invalidate the research, it merely indicates our initial calculations required refinement. The answer had been perfectly honest, perfectly damning, and perfectly useless for prosecution. Orcus had broken laws, but they'd done so in service of research that a terrified public half wanted to continue despite their stated outrage. Emma Frost watched the hearings from her penthouse office, her diamond-hard composure restored after 3 weeks of recovery from the telepathic strain that had nearly killed her. The congressional circus would continue for months, she knew. Investigations, sanctions, reforms that changed nothing fundamental about humanity's relationship with enhanced individuals. But the data was what mattered. Polling showed persistent shifts in public opinion. Not dramatic reversals, but measurable movement toward viewing mutants as necessary, rather than merely tolerated. The dimensional tear crisis had provided narrative that 17% of the population now cited when asked about enhanced individual value. 17% wasn't victory, but it was better than extinction. Her communicator chimed with incoming call from Scott Summers. She answered without bothering to hide her exhaustion. Scott, to what do I owe the pleasure of this check-in? Surely the X-Men have more pressing matters than coordinating with the morally compromised Hellfire Club. We need to talk about the data Orcus collected. Scott replied, his tone suggesting this wasn't a social call. Beast has been analyzing the Threshold's telemetry from the gala. Emma, they recorded everything. Every measurement of his vector manipulation, every energy signature from the dimensional distortion, complete environmental data from when he inverted their device. It's all in Orcus's database. Emma felt cold certainty settle in her chest. And you're concerned they'll use that data for what purpose exactly? He's gone returned to whatever reality spawned him. The dimensional tiers are sealed. What threat does archived data represent? The threat that they'll try to replicate it, Scott said quietly. Not him specifically. They can't recreate whatever fundamental difference makes his consciousness operate on mathematical principles. But his methodology, the vector manipulation framework, the ability to redirect force according to calculated inversion. Beast thinks Orcus is developing technology that mimics his capabilities. Sentinels that don't just adapt to attacks, but reflect them entirely. The implications crystallized with the kind of clarity that made Emma's telepathic precision feel crude by comparison. Orcus had lost their political momentum, but they'd gained something more valuable, a blueprint for technology that could make their Sentinels functionally invincible, by giving them the one ability that had made Accelerator unstoppable. That's terrifying, Emma admitted, but also inevitable. The moment he demonstrated vector manipulation at that scale, every organization with sufficient resources began researching replication methods. You can't put that particular genie back in the bottle, Scott. The knowledge exists. Someone will weaponize it. Not if we get there first, Scott replied. Xavier and I have been discussing it. If the technology is inevitable, better that it's developed by people who use it for protection rather than oppression. We're proposing a joint research initiative, X-Men Hellfire Club, and select government oversight to prevent abuse. We study his methodology, develop defensive applications, and ensure the technology serves everyone, rather than just those who fear enhanced individuals. Emma processed the proposal with a strategic calculation that had kept the Hellfire Club relevant for centuries. You're suggesting we legitimize research into recreating the capabilities of an interdimensional anomaly who let 17 people die, rather than compromise his experimental data collection. The optics on that are complex. The optics on everything are complex, Scott countered. But the alternative is watching Orcus develop the technology in secret, deploy it without oversight, and use it to justify even more extreme containment measures. At least if we're involved, we can shape how it's applied. I'll need to consult with the club's leadership, Emma said, already calculating Sebastian Shaw's response. The internal politics that would shape the decision. But provisionally, I agree. Better to be part of the conversation than excluded from it. Send me Beast's preliminary analysis. I'll have our technical specialists review it. The call ended, leaving Emma alone with thoughts that refused comfortable resolution. They'd survived the immediate crisis, sealed the tears, shifted public opinion towards something less hostile than open warfare. But the fundamental problem remained: enhanced individuals and baseline humans trying to coexist on a planet where power differentials made genuine equality impossible. And now they had data from someone who demonstrated just how impossible those differentials could become. Her phone buzzed with message from Sebastian Shaw. She read it twice before the implications fully registered. There's been an incident. Krakoa. You need to see this. In Westchester, Charles Xavier sat in Cerebro's chamber, the amplification helmet connecting him to psychic networks that spanned the globe. What he felt made him wonder if 3 weeks of apparent calm had been a mistake interpreted as victory. The dimensional barrier between Earth 616 and the Tuaru universe showed stress fractures. Not tears like the ones they'd sealed. Those had been exit wounds, reality's trauma from contact with mathematics that rewrote physical law. These were different, intentional, calculated. Someone was probing the barrier, testing it, learning how to open controlled passages between realities with the same methodical precision that had characterized every other action they'd observed. Charles? Jean's telepathic presence found him immediately, her concern bleeding through their connection. I feel it too. He's coming back. Perhaps in Samas, Xavier replied, his vast awareness tracking the stress patterns with growing unease. Or perhaps he never fully left. The dimensional tears we sealed were symptoms, Jean. The real wound is deeper. He fundamentally altered how reality behaves at the intersection of our worlds. We can seal individual tears, but we can't undo the knowledge that realities can be bridged with sufficient understanding. Then what do we do? Jean asked her question, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 3 weeks hoping the crisis was finished. We prepare, Xavier said simply. We document everything we've learned. We refine our coordination protocols. We accept that this may not be the last time we encounter entities that operate outside our philosophical frameworks. And we remember that we won not by defeating him, but by solving the problems his presence created. That's not victory, Charles. That's survival with good publicity. Sometimes those are the same thing. Xavier replied, his telepathic touch gentle, despite the harsh truth. We're still here. Mutants still have a future, even if it's more complicated than we'd hoped. That counts for something. In the congressional hearing room, testimony continued with the mechanical persistence of government proceedings. A junior representative from a district that had voted overwhelmingly for enhanced individual registration. asked the question that had been building for 3 weeks. Dr. Killian, you've testified that the threshold was designed to test omega-level limits through controlled stress. You've admitted that the device's inversion demonstrated capabilities beyond your initial projections. But you haven't addressed the fundamental question if an individual with vector manipulation abilities of that magnitude returned if the dimensional barriers proved insufficient to prevent re-entry. Do you have any countermeasures? Any technology that could contain or neutralize such a threat? Killian's expression didn't change, but those watching carefully caught the microsecond pause before he answered. The data collected from the Gala incident provides baseline parameters for developing appropriate response systems. I cannot discuss classified research in open session, but I can state with confidence that Orcus takes the threat of interdimensional incursions seriously. We are pursuing multiple technological solutions to ensure humanity has protection should such scenarios recur. The answer satisfied the representative. It terrified everyone who understood what it actually meant. Orcus was building something, using data from Accelerator's demonstration to create weapons or defenses that operated on principles humanity had only glimpsed through catastrophe. They were doing it in secret beyond oversight, justified by the same fear that had nearly destroyed mutant-human relations entirely. In the observation gallery, a figure in a tailored suit made notes with practiced discretion. The notes would reach specific people, those with resources to act on intelligence, those with interests in ensuring technological development occurred under controlled conditions. One of those notes would reach Emma Frost before day's end. Another would find its way to Beast's encrypted inbox. A third would be hand-delivered to an office in the Department of Defense, where people worried about threats that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. The information network was activating, responding to perceived danger with the organic coordination that made intelligence communities dangerous despite their bureaucratic inefficiencies. Far from Earth in orbit, the conventional satellites didn't occupy something stirred. Monitoring stations that Orcus had deployed in secret positioned to watch for dimensional anomalies with sensitivity that exceeded anything publicly acknowledged. The readings were subtle. Stress fractures in space-time too small for conventional detection, but unmistakable to sensors designed specifically to catch exactly this signature. The dimensional barrier between realities was being probed, tested, measured with the patience of someone conducting research rather than planning invasion. The data flowed to Orcus Command, where analysts worked in shifts to interpret signals that represented humanity's first real-time observation of interdimensional contact. Dr. Killian reviewed their reports with the same clinical detachment he'd shown during congressional testimony. Analysis confirms intelligent probing, the senior analyst reported. The stress patterns are too precise to be random dimensional fluctuation. Someone on the other side is learning how our barrier behaves, mapping its structure, calculating optimal breach points. Time frame for potential incursion, Killian asked. Unknown. The probing is methodical, suggesting extended research rather than immediate action. Could be weeks. Could be years. We're detecting investigation, not preparation for assault. Killian studied the data streams with focus that made his junior analysts nervous. Prepare contingencies for both scenarios. If he's investigating return options, we need to be ready to respond. Whether that's containment negotiation or neutralization depends on circumstances we can't predict yet. And increase monitoring sensitivity. I want to know the moment investigation shifts to action. The analysts dispersed to their tasks, leaving Killian alone with thoughts he would never commit to official record. They'd pushed an Omega-level entity to demonstrate capabilities that rewrote physics, collected data that revealed just how outmatched conventional force was against someone who could make mathematics negotiate. And now that entity was researching return protocols with the same methodical precision that had characterized every other action. Not attacking, not invading, just learning, calculating, preparing for whatever came next with the patient certainty of someone who had all the time required. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Killian felt something approaching anticipation. They'd gathered incomplete data from single encounter. More data meant better models, refined projections. Technology developed from deeper understanding. The next iteration would be educational for both sides. An Academy City in a reality adjacent to Earth. Munsings, but separated by dimensional barriers that were proving less absolute than originally believed. Accelerator stood in a repaired testing chamber and reviewed the data he'd collected from 3 weeks in another world. The scientists monitoring him maintained careful distance, their instruments recording, while their instincts screamed to flee. They'd seen the dimensional fracture that had taken him, witnessed his return through rifts that shouldn't have been survivable, processed the reality distortion residue that clung to him like radiation. They had no idea what he'd encountered. They just knew he'd come back different. Not more powerful, the vector manipulation operated at the same fundamental level, but refined, optimized. He'd tested his capabilities against opponents who operated at scales. Academy City's espers never approached processed combat data from entities whose abilities represented different theoretical frameworks entirely. The Level 6 Shift Project Director approached with trepidation that came from asking questions of someone who'd recently demonstrated the ability to invert weapons designed to force evolutionary transcendence. The dimensional anomaly that took you, can you replicate it? Intentionally open passages to that reality. Accelerator considered the question with clinical precision. The dimensional barriers between realities operated on vector principles like everything else. Directional components governed energy flow between adjacent spaces. Sufficient force applied with calculated precision could create controlled breaches rather than catastrophic tears. Yes, he replied simply. Given sufficient power source and appropriate targeting parameters. The barriers are permeable if you understand the mathematics governing their stability. And what did you find there? The director asked, unable to resist, despite knowing the question might be unwelcome. In the other reality, Accelerator's expression didn't change. But his response carried something that might have been interest if such concepts applied to him. A world where enhanced individuals operate under different theoretical constraints, where ability classifications follow biological rather than purely mathematical logic, where politics and power structures create environments that generate reliably predictable responses to applied stress. Predictable, the director echoed. You fought their most powerful individuals. Reports suggest massive casualties, dimensional instability, political catastrophe. That doesn't sound predictable. The outcomes were predicted within acceptable variance. Accelerator corrected. Variables behaved according to established patterns. Enhanced individuals prioritized civilian protection over tactical advantage. Political organizations weaponized media coverage. Heroic figures made suboptimal decisions based on ideological constraints. Every response followed from clearly defined priorities, which makes future interactions calculable. The director felt cold understanding settle over him. You're planning to return. Eventually, Accelerator confirmed. When the dimensional barriers stabilize sufficiently for controlled transit, the Level 6 Shift Project requires data about evolutionary transcendence under extreme conditions. That world's enhanced individuals operate at power levels comparable to theoretical Level 6 parameters. Continued testing provides optimal research environment. But the damage, the casualties, are consequences of choices made by entities operating under ethical constraints I don't share. Accelerator interrupted. They choose to protect civilians during combat. They choose to prioritize reputation over tactical efficiency. They choose to respond predictably to applied pressure. Those choices create the environment, not my presence. The director had no response that wouldn't be immediately discarded as irrelevant philosophy. He retreated to his monitoring station and began drafting reports that would climb through Academy City's administrative hierarchy until someone with authority made decisions about whether Accelerator's interdimensional research should continue. Those reports would languish in bureaucratic review for months. By the time anyone with actual authority noticed them, the decisions would already be made through action rather than authorization. In a research facility beneath Academy City's administrative district, technicians analyzed the dimensional residue Accelerator had brought back. The energy signatures matched nothing in their database's physics, operating under rules that contradicted established Esper theory while remaining internally consistent. "This is remarkable," one technician whispered to her colleague, their instruments recording phenomena that shouldn't exist according to Academy City's understanding of how reality worked. The dimensional barriers aren't absolute. They're permeable to sufficient understanding. What we're seeing here suggests entire networks of adjacent realities, all operating under slightly different physical laws, but all connected through mathematical principles we're only beginning to map. "That's terrifying," her colleague replied. "If barriers are permeable, what stops hostile entities from other realities invading Academy City? What prevents dimensional collapse? Better too many breaches open simultaneously. The same thing that prevents any catastrophic scenario," the first technician said. "Understanding and control. If we can map the mathematics governing dimensional stability, we can predict threats before they materialize. We can develop defenses, establish protocols, ensure Academy City's safety through superior calculation." They didn't notice Accelerator standing in the observation gallery above their workspace, his red eyes tracking their analysis with clinical interest. They were asking the right questions, reaching toward conclusions that would shape Academy City's research direction for years. Good. That meant when he opened controlled passages to the other reality, the infrastructure would exist to support sustained investigation rather than one-off catastrophic breaches. The Level 6 Shift project had always been about transcending human limitations through evolutionary pressure. He'd found a pressure environment that exceeded anything Academy City could artificially create, a world full of Omega-level entities operating under constraints that made them reliably exploitable. The mathematics were clear. The next iteration would incorporate lessons learned from initial contact. Variables would be refined approach strategies, optimized outcome projections, updated based on observed behavioral patterns. He would return. Not today, not this month. But eventually, when the dimensional barriers stabilized sufficiently for controlled transit, when preparation was complete and probability matrices favored successful data collection. And when he did, that world's heroes would respond exactly as they had before, predictably, ethically, suboptimally. They would protect civilians, prioritize public perception, make decisions based on moral frameworks that constrained tactical efficiency. They would, in short, behave like variables in an equation he was learning to solve. In Westchester, the X-Men gathered one final time to review lessons learned and prepare for futures they couldn't predict. The War Room's displays showed data compiled from 3 weeks of analysis, casualty statistics, dimensional tear closure rates, public opinion polling, congressional testimony transcripts. Final assessment. Scott said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 weeks coordinating crisis response while managing political fallout. "We survived. Mutant human relations are damaged, but not destroyed. The tiers are sealed. Orcus is facing oversight, and we've demonstrated value through action. That's as close to victory as we could reasonably expect given the circumstances. But he's still out there," Logan said, stating what everyone was thinking. "And the dimensional barriers aren't as solid as we thought. Nothing stops him from coming back if he decides there's more data to collect." "Which is why we prepare," Xavier said from his position at the head of the table. "We've learned his methodology, identified his priorities. Recognize that traditional combat approaches won't work. If he returns, we'll be ready not to defeat him, but to manage the consequences of his presence while minimizing casualties. That's not exactly inspiring, Professor, Kitty observed. We're basically planning to lose better next time. Sometimes losing better is the only victory available. Xavier replied with the wisdom earned through decades of impossible situations. We can't match his power. We can't change his fundamental nature. But we can protect people, solve problems, and prove that heroism matters, even when we can't win through conventional means. That's what X-Men do. Jean stood her presence radiating determination that had sustained the team through apocalypses. Charles is right. We don't measure success by defeating every threat. We measure it by protecting people despite the threats we can't defeat. We saved lives at the gala. We sealed the tears. We shifted public opinion toward acceptance. Those are real victories, even if they're not the total triumph we wanted. And if the dimensional probing Xavier detected means he's planning return, Storm asked. Then we do what we always do, Scott replied. We prepare, we coordinate, we fight smarter instead of harder. We work with Emma and the Hellfire Club, share intelligence with oversight authorities, and we make damn sure that when he arrives, we're ready to protect civilians and manage consequences. Not defeat, not containment protection, and consequence management. That's achievable. The meeting continued for another hour, assignments distributed, protocols, established, contingencies planned. By the time they dispersed, the X-Men had transformed abstract fear into concrete preparation. But in the quiet moments afterward, when heroic determination gave way to honest assessment, they all understood the same fundamental truth: they'd survived first contact with something that operated outside their frameworks. Next time, if there was a next time, the outcome would depend not on their power, but on their ability to outthink an entity that viewed thinking as applied mathematics. It wasn't encouraging, but it was realistic. And realism had kept them alive through crises that optimism couldn't survive. In her penthouse, Emma Frost stood before floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the city below continue its rhythms of commerce and survival. Somewhere in that cityscape, Orcus was developing technology based on data from an entity who'd casually inverted their most advanced weapons. Somewhere in congressional offices, politicians were drafting legislation that would shape enhanced individual rights for generations. Somewhere in research facilities, scientists were studying dimensional barriers with newfound understanding that realities were permeable to sufficient calculation. And somewhere in another dimension, an entity built on vector mathematics was processing data from 3 weeks of exposure to a world it had briefly treated as experimental environment. The game wasn't over. It had barely started. And the next iteration would incorporate everything both sides had learned from initial contact. Emma raised a glass to the city below, to the battles won and lost, to the catastrophes survived and consequences managed. To the fundamental recognition that some problems couldn't be solved, only endured with strategic intelligence. To mathematics, she said quietly, the toast heard by no one. May we learn to speak its language before it finishes solving us. The glass touched her lips. The city continued its night rhythms, and in the spaces between realities, dimensional barriers flexed under pressure from probing that was patient, methodical, and utterly certain of eventual success. The equation wasn't finished. It had simply moved to its next phase, incorporating new variables and refining its approach toward solutions that neither side could fully predict. Mathematics, after all, never stopped solving itself. It just kept calculating until the answer became inevitable.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.